suffocation, my mind starts to roam. A broken communication, we're together, we're alone. We are always surrounded, even at home. Those things we said, those things we did, all piled up on our heads. We swam below the river of it all. We floated so far where we've been, trying to tell you I feel like I've been living alone. No, I'm not certain you notice when I get home. Faceless in blue light, now it hardly ever grows dark. I'll be sitting in the kitchen if you think you wanna try to start. Those things we said, those things we did, all piled up on our heads. We swam below the river of it all. We floated so far where we've been. This is the part where I repeat myself.
It's June the 8th, Tuesday morning. This show is presented proudly by our title sponsor, Bitcoin Well. Of course, there's a lot going on right now when it comes to crypto. Bitcoin and others in a bit of a nosedive right now, and a lot of people are trying to figure out exactly what the smart play is. If you'd like some insight into why it's trending the way it is, why it was so high before, and why some people believe it's bouncing back up, you can contact the team at Bitcoin Well. Plus, look for their Bitcoin ATMs across Canada. You'll find them under the sponsors tab at ryanjesperson.com.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
Well, good morning, friends, and thanks for joining us. Obviously, a horrific story out of London, Ontario, and we'll be talking in just a moment to the CEO of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, Mustafa Farouk, will join us in just a moment. A devastating mass murder, an act of terrorism, quite frankly. A 20-year-old man in custody after police allege a family was intentionally mowed down. This guy driving a black pickup truck, claiming the lives of four people, four family members, including a 74-year-old woman, a man and woman in their 40s, and a 15-year-old girl. That's a grandmother, it's a mom and a dad, and their teenage daughter. That's who it is. The 9-year-old son surviving, described in very serious but stable condition, recovering in hospital. As the city of London, Ontario, obviously the nation and people around the world grapple with this heinous hate crime. This isn't the type of time, this isn't the type of circumstance where you attempt to make sense of something like this. Nothing about this makes sense. People are numb, and I know that Mustafa in just a moment will no doubt have some insight for us into how Muslims across the country and beyond, I'm sure, are processing this act of targeted hate and violence, this hate crime. Federal investigators are assisting local police in investigating this crime, and there has been the potential noted of terrorism charges here, and we'll get into that. Author Julie Lalonde, by the way, will join us in about 10 minutes from now. Julie, the author of a number of books, including Resilience is Futile. She's lived harassment. She's an expert on violence and bystander intervention. Julie's been requested and suggested by many of our audience members, and we're grateful that she's made time, clearing time for us this morning. Of course, if you're paying attention to social media, you've no doubt seen, hundreds or thousands on your feed, expressions of grief and sorrow. People absolutely appalled. Here's some of the tweets that I noticed over the past 36 hours or so. Of course, this crime occurring on Sunday. And it's really all Canadians are talking about last night and into today. A friend of this show, you've heard Dr. Mana Saleh on the show before. Earlier this evening, she tweets, "I canceled plans to walk with a dear friend after news of the Solomon family murders. I just couldn't. I'll continue to live unapologetically," says Mana, "as a Muslim woman in hijab. Hate will not win. But tonight, like so many others, I am angry and grieving." My former colleague, global reporter Camille Karamali, "This hits so close to home for so many of us," he writes. "My Pakistani Muslim family often go on walks after dinner, sometimes in traditional clothing. I keep thinking about them." Donovan Bennett, a broadcaster with Sportsnet, says, "Don't say it doesn't happen here. Came here for a better life only to lose their life. Make sure you use the word terrorist, premeditated, targeted, travesty. Prayers up for the London community. I love my Muslim brothers and sisters across the country who need our love." That from broadcaster Donovan Bennett. Heike tweeted, I hate the word Islamophobia. Phobias are supposed to be natural and beyond your control, like acrophobia. This shit ain't natural. Journalists can use, quote, anti-Muslim hate, right? Center people in the discussion. This isn't about our fear of our religion. It's hatred toward our existence. Terms like Islamophobia allow people to cover behind both sides, or I have freedom of speech. This ain't Islamophobia. And here's one more from Hazi Habib, who tweeted, "There's a problem with the term Islamophobia. The word used to describe the hate and bigotry against Muslims makes excuses for perpetrators. It blames Muslims for being scary, so to speak. You know what's scary? A radicalized white supremacist who murdered a family with his car." Not wrong. It's a horrific act of violence. It's obviously a hate crime. The mayor of London, Ontario, has spoken on this, as have a number of elected officials, of course, at every level of government. Ed Holder is the mayor of London, said this was an act of mass murder perpetrated against Muslims. It was rooted in unspeakable hatred. The magnitude of such hatred can make one question who we are or who we were as a city. He said, "I speak on behalf of all Londoners when I say our hearts are broken. We grieve for the family, 3 generations of whom are now deceased. We weep for their loved ones. We pray for the recovery of the 9-year-old boy who remains in hospital." The Prime Minister said in a tweet he was horrified by the news. Said the Right Honourable Justin Trudeau, "Islamophobia has no place in any of our communities. The hate is insidious and despicable, and it must stop." Premier Doug Ford out of Ontario demanding a stop in a tweet to these heinous acts of violence. The National Council of Canadian Muslims, over the course of from 2015 to 2019, it was a 4-year span, tracked more than 300 incidents, including more than 30 acts of physical violence. 300 incidents over the course of 4 years. That, of course, includes that gun attack, you remember, on the 29th of January back in 2017 on the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec that left 6 people dead, 19 more injured. It was one of the deadliest. It is one of the deadliest mass shootings in Canada's recent history. So we reach out to our community members. Jake says it's the same sort of a thing, that phobia that's making me think about, Islamophobia. Jake says it's the same word about homophobia. I never thought about it that way. Says it's a good point. Kelly Joe says language is just so important. Erica chiming in as well says the same reason I don't like the term homophobic when you're describing LGBTQ slurs and insults. It has nothing to do with fear, and it has everything to do with hate. It's a great point. That's not something that's been on my radar before, and I look forward to having that conversation. Perhaps we've crossed wires with Mustafa Farouk. I know that he's doing a lot of interviews right now. Sam and Sarah will keep me posted if he does chime in, and we'll make sure that he gets on the show. In the meantime, public educator and author Julie Lalonde joining us this morning. She's been working for years improving the lives of women and girls in Canada with a focus on engaging bystanders. There's bystander intervention opportunities. This is where you can create communities of support. She's been teaching these as part of a series of free workshops, and we'll have details on that in just a moment. Sam, I can't see. What's the sign say that you just showed me? Just let me know what's going on.
Oh, just said Julie's not quite ready.
Julie's not quite ready yet. Okay, thanks. Good stuff.
In
okay, just let me know. That's great. We'll get to author Julie Lalonde in just a second. Sam, in the meantime, why don't I just remind our friends that we'll be checking the hashtag RealTalkRJ this morning. And, of course, you can be in touch with the show both when we're live as well as, later on. If you're catching the podcast later on, RealTalkRJ is the hashtag that we're keeping an eye on. It's presented by the team at Park Power. Park Power powering the Real Talk hashtag, and at parkpower.ca you'll see if you use the promo code 2021-Real Talk, they're going to give you $70 off your first bill. That's commercial, residential, industrial at parkpower.ca, internet, electricity, and natural gas. You can check out their social media accounts as well. Lots of great information there. Thanks to the team at Park Power for your ongoing support. The team at Friesen Brothers wants to remind you that the Father's Day boxes are coming up. This is a really neat opportunity to show a lot of love for Dad on Father's Day, but save yourself a whole bunch of work. I've seen these Father's Day boxes. It's great. They've thought of everything from the cinnamon buns you need for Father's Day morning all the way through to some great pre-prepared dips and snacks, perfect for midday, and then all the fixins for a perfect barbecue. Whether Dad's going to be out there on the grill, whether you're going to be grilling for Dad, whatever the case may be, Friesen Brothers has you covered at their stores in South Edmonton, Stony Plain, and Fort Saskatchewan. Of course, in total, 16 stores across the province of Alberta. For more information, check out their website. We link to it under the sponsors tab at ryanjesperson.com. As mentioned, Julie Lalonde, our guest this morning, her memoir, Resilience is Futile. The Life and Death and Life of Julie S. Lalonde, published spring of 2020 with rave reviews. It won the 2020 Ontario Speakers Award. It was named one of the best books of the year by CBC Books and the Hill Times. Julie's also contributed to Sick of the System, Why the COVID-19 Recovery Must Be Revolutionary. A pleasure to welcome her to Real Talk. Thanks for making time this morning, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I don't know. I mean, what question do you begin with when everyone's processing the horror of what happened in London, Ontario? I guess I can ask you where your head's at, but I suspect you'll tell me you're numb and appalled, but I don't want to assume anything.
Absolutely. I am appalled and I am horrified, but I'm not shocked because we have seen with, for just example, just a few years ago, right? Like the Quebec City mosque shooting, we have seen these kinds of crimes happen. We have seen this Islamophobia, this hatred of Muslim folks that's really rooted in xenophobia. But we've also seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes over the past year. We've seen a rise in sexual violence. Like, we know that the pandemic has brought a lot of fear. And with that comes, frankly, the worst versions of people coming to the forefront. So I don't want to blame the pandemic for what happened on Sunday, because I don't think that's appropriate. But I do want to get folks to understand that we are seeing a rise in all kinds of different hate crimes. And that's not a coincidence.
I was all over your Twitter yesterday, but the important messages that you were sharing from other people, you were amplifying people's voices, and you had your own thoughts, including this one where you beg Canadian media to once again, you say, remember that these losers want infamy. They want their manifestos and their rotten ideas to proliferate. They want to recruit. You say, do not give them the platform they so desperately crave. You can't shame someone who's proud to be shit. If the Toronto Star publishes this wanker's police interview like they did with the van attack in Toronto, you say, I swear to God, I'll flip every table in sight. You're not an expert in terrorism, but you do work with angry young men every day. You say you've been getting death threats from pond scum for 2 decades. You say fucking starve them of the attention they want. And then you go on to talk about what a white high school student called you in a workshop last week. You say anybody who's been paying attention knows many young white men are furious. Can you tell us about this interaction last week?
Yeah, so I'm a public educator who spends most of my time training people on how to prevent violence against women and how to respond to it as a bystander. And I was giving a workshop on street harassment, the reality of street harassment, and exactly what I said, the fact that we're seeing such a rise in sexual violence, racism, homophobia, transphobia. And so I was asking them to think about, who is impacted by harassment in our community. And this was to a series of high schools. And there was this one young man in particular that was so mad that I wasn't talking about how white people are the ones who are being targeted. White people are the ones disproportionately being harassed in the streets, and just could not let it go. And when I refused to acknowledge his comment, because the joy of online training is, if I don't read your response out loud, no one has to hear it. So he couldn't physically interrupt me like he would in a workshop. So then he went on to call me a race traitor and said that I was, clearly not a good white person because I wasn't talking about how white people are being harmed by harassment. And that is one tiny example of what we are seeing in our schools in this country, which is a real rise in young, particularly white men who are enraged by the concept of equality, who feel like women are trying to take something away from them, that people of color are trying to take something away from them. And this really simplistic idea that equity and justice is a pie and there's only so much pie to go around. And if women and people of color get more pie, then I'm going to starve to death. And so I see that, unfortunately, every day in my work. And it's not every young man. There's a lot of young men that are furious about what's going on and want to help. But there is very much a disturbing trend of young men blaming women and people of color for all of their problems in the world. And we have seen the results of that anger.
Julie, the official report to this point, early in this investigation out of London, Ontario, is that they say that the suspect in this case, this young man facing 4 charges of first-degree murder, 1 charge of attempted murder, was not officially known to police, was not officially on the record known to be any member of hate groups, although there have been some rumblings online that there may have been some exposure or some allegiance or affiliation to some of these groups. What do you think it is in your studies, in your lived and personal experience, academic and otherwise, what do you think it is that's contributing to this rise in angst and anger and hate and in the worst case scenarios, violence?
Prior to the pandemic, we still saw incredible isolation. And we know that when young people, especially young men, are isolated and they don't feel like they have a sense of community, they will seek out that community in some way. And if we don't create healthy spaces for young men to congregate and learn and chat with each other, then we know that those young men are very much at risk of being recruited, whether it's things like incels and the idea that, women are the cause of all of your problems, or whether it's white supremacist organizations, xenophobic organizations. People will recruit young men who feel disenchanted, who feel left out, who feel like they're not part of a community. And unfortunately, the pandemic has just cranked that volume up to 11, right? We have people who are stuck in their houses, who are consuming media all day long, who spend their entire lives online. And it's very easy to fall down a rabbit hole. And I use the example that I've created a PSA for stalking victims. And it's up on YouTube. It's called Outside of the Shadows. And it's a 5-minute PSA for victims of stalking and what allies can do to support them. And the next recommendation that the algorithm gives you from YouTube is how to get out of a restraining order if someone has put a restraining order against you. Like, it's literally one click away from positive to really dark place. And that's just mainstream YouTube. That's not even getting into sort of the darker corners of the internet. So it's very easy for someone who feels angsty and alone to find a community really quickly. And I don't think we've done enough to take that seriously. And when we think about radicalization in Canada, we still have a very racist idea of who's being radicalized. When in fact, what we're seeing is that it's a lot of young white men.
Yeah, let me ask you for your, this may sound like I'm teeing this up on a silver platter, but I don't know how you're going to answer this, but I suspect I do, because I see people across the country saying it's very important that this is called terrorism. It's very important that the word terrorism is invoked. Do you believe that that's important here? And if so, why or why not?
I think it has a purpose, but I think if we're going to call what happened in London on Sunday terrorism, then we need to call the Toronto van attack terrorism as well, which was not done. We know that there are various ways in which young men are being radicalized. And I think socially, the term terrorism has some power. I think it is powerful when that term is being used because people sort of perk up and pay attention. But the word terrorism and the history of how the word terrorism is applied is in really racist, xenophobic ways. So there's pros and cons. And I think we saw this with the Proud Boys, for example, when they were recently designated a terrorist organization. They were very quick to say, oh, we're disbanding. Now, no one actually believes that they're disbanding, but it did create enough stigma around associating yourself with the Proud Boys that it dissuaded some folks from participating. So I do think there's some power in that labeling, but I know that it's important to also contextualize that the way in which, anti-terrorist policies are implemented is often targeting the wrong people.
You're an expert in bystander intervention, and I know that, and there are a couple of specific, anecdotes or historical references I'd like to make recent history, including, incidents that have occurred on public transit or in the city of Edmonton. I'm sure you're aware that there have been a series of violent attacks, targeted attacks against hijabi women, Muslim women in the city of Edmonton. We see this all around us, but you can engage bystanders, or you can confront hatred or extremism or whatever the case may be in a number of different ways, and people are going to be comfortable with different things. You mentioned the Proud Boys, and that's one of interest. You've got the Proud Boys, you've got these 3% or the Soldiers of Odin. I'm a little out of my depth once we start really getting into the weeds here, but they flare up from time to time. You'll see at rallies the vests or the groups. What do you think is an appropriate and let me just say a safe, a prudent way for people to confront this in their communities? And what if you see some guy you went to high school with walking around with one of these vests on now? What does a bystander or a civilian do?
I think if you are dealing with organized terrorist groups that are marching or demonstrating in public, then I think we need to exercise as much caution as we can to keep ourselves safe. But I think, as you said, the key is the personal connections that we have. It's like you said, the guy you went to high school with who all of a sudden is now very interested in QAnon and conspiracy theories, or is like very interested in how, Asian people cause COVID. Like using your personal connection to someone to try to remind them of their own humanity, but also to try and very slowly sort of chip away at who they've become and the things that they believe. That is what we know can be effective, is using the personal connection that you have with folks. Now, if you are a person of color and your white friend is becoming radicalized, I don't think it's your responsibility to subject yourself to that in order to change them. But that's where the allyship piece comes in, right? Well, this is where white people need to be pulling aside other white people who are going down these really dark paths and try to sort of keep them onto the light side of life. But in terms of writ large, what folks can do as everyday people who are bystanders to, anti-Asian racism, or like you said, Muslim women being targeted, what's really important to understand about bystander intervention is your goal is not to try to reason with the harasser. Your goal is to create a safety bubble between you and the person that is being targeted. And that's where things go off the rails. People really think their job is to tell off every creep and tell off every racist. But in the moment, it's actually more important to protect the person that is being targeted. And frankly, the research shows that oftentimes you have to make a choice. You can either tell off the harasser or you can keep the victim safe, but you can't often do both safely on your own. So my advice is always prioritize the safety of the victim. And that means, maybe creating a distraction so they have an exit strategy, things like pretending to know them, being like, oh my God, how are you? I haven't seen you in so long. Like, any kind of way in which you can engage in conversation so they can lock eyes with you and then exit the situation. Really non-confrontational forms of intervention exist, but too often people think my only option is I got to be direct, I got to confront this guy. That feels too scary, so I'm not going to do anything. But there's actually lots more you can do that goes beyond confrontation.
It's so, I can think of these so many different scenarios. There's a fellow by the name of Manwar Khan out of Edmonton, and I remember interviewing him many years ago. He witnessed what ultimately proved to be tragically a fatal beating on an Edmonton LRT, and subsequent to his experience as a bystander, he started a group to confront hatred in the community. He became a community advocate and really has done admirable work since then. But he personally, I mean, not taking away from the victim of the attack, but Mauer himself and other people were absolutely traumatized by the experience. I'm providing really local examples here, Julie, but it probably reiterates that everybody that's going to hear this podcast or see the show could probably provide their own examples. A number of years ago, an Edmonton police officer attacked by a knife-wielding man outside Commonwealth Stadium, stabbed, almost killed. The suspect went on to take a U-Haul truck through downtown Edmonton and mow people down. And the surveillance video or the street video of the attack on the police officer, what was really notable about it, and I want to be fair here, so I'll be sure to clarify, but there were people all around. I mean, there were 3 or 4 people off the top of my head based on my memory that in some circumstances basically watched it happen. People would say, this is a bit of a probably, questionable remark, but like full big grown men type thing, the type of scenario where you'd go, what the hell? Why are this cop's about to get stabbed? Why aren't people jumping in? How are we hardwired as humans when we encounter an unexpected circumstance like this?
So the fight-flight response is something folks talk about a lot in the context of being victims. So you are, presented with you're being attacked or you're being harmed in some way, and then you freeze or you fight. And that's sort of this very simplistic understanding that we have. It's actually much more complicated than that. And it includes bystanders, exactly as you said. So folks, when we see shocking things, we can freeze and just be absolutely stunned by what happened, which, oftentimes these things that happen in public are shocking. They're not expected. But more than that, we know there's this phenomenon called the bystander effect, which is when there is a crowd of folks around, we do what's called the diffusion of responsibility. So we see 10 people and we think, oh, that's 10 people that can do something. And we're all thinking that, so no one reacts. But the good news about the bystander effect is that it's not inevitable. So the first person to do something really shakes people out of their freeze response and compels them to act. So even something as simple as saying out loud, hey, what's going on here? Literally just doing that can make people standing around sort of be like, oh yeah, what is going on here? And then kind of involve them in intervening. So we know the first person to do something doesn't have to do everything, but they set off kind of this chain reaction where other folks feel like, okay, I'm not going to be alone because this person's paying attention. Oh, and now this person's paying attention. And that's what emboldens people to get involved.
Have advancements in technology changed the conversation around bystander intervention or violence prevention or street harassment at all?
Well, I think it has created opportunities for us to document it in different ways. So Hollaback, which is the organization that I work with, we started in 2005 when smartphones were really kind of new technology, and we created an app where you could document your experience on the street. Then a little doc was on a map. We could start tracking where these things happen. So technology has allowed us, with George Floyd, someone was able to record what was going on in that moment, which really changed the public conversation about it. So tools like technology have been used to increase harassment. So it's easier to take upskirt photos. It's easier to follow people. It's easier to stalk them. It's like there's unfortunately so many ways in which technology is used against victims. But it has also created an opportunity for us to document, which is actually one of the forms of intervention that we encourage folks to do, which is recording things when you see them happening, which then emboldens the victim to be able to report it, but also changes the narrative. Because this isn't just, one person of color arguing they were targeted. Here is documented evidence that I was targeted. And that is how I think technology can be used to advance this conversation that, frankly, we've been having as long as public spaces have existed.
Julie S. Lalonde, our guest, if you're just tuning in, if you're streaming us live on the Mixlr audio app, we wish you a good morning. Julie has mentioned we'd had audience members pretty much since our show launched back in November that have been asking us to reach out to you. They've been eager to hear from you. One of them was Tracy. Back in April, as a matter of fact, she reached out to us. We had just spoken about Emily Cave. She lost her husband Colby, who is an Edmonton Oiler, to a medical incident, a sudden medical incident, an unexpected and tragic death. And Emily has been experiencing harassment online as a result of, or at least connected to, her husband's passing. Really deplorable stuff. And we talked about it on the show, and Tracy had reached out to us, and she said, regarding what Emily Cave has been forced to endure, I think that Julie S. Lalonde would be great to speak to this, and would be a great opportunity as well for her to speak to her free online bystander intervention webinars. And Tracy was eager to hear you speak about that. I'm taking a look here at ihollaback.org. And I'm not sure if you're involved in all of these. You can clarify, but I see there's these free training sessions on things like, bystander intervention to stop anti-Asian harassment or xenophobia, bystander intervention to stop police-sponsored violence or anti-black racist harassment, stand up against street harassment, different events. How different is the training? How different is the subject matter? Whether you're talking about anti-black racism, anti-Asian racism, so-called police-sponsored violence, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, so the tenets of bystander intervention are very, very similar. In Canada, we've been running what's called We Stand Up trainings, which are specific to street harassment. So if you come to my website, you can see the schedule of the Canadian trainings. So the ones that you just talked about are trainings that have been going on in the US since last spring. We were really at the forefront of recognizing that, the president calling it the Chinese flu is absolutely going to lead to incidents of anti-Asian racism, which we saw. So big shout outs to the folks in the US, including Asian Americans Accessing Justice, which is an organization that's been putting on thousands of these trainings since last spring. But the goal of the We Stand Up trainings is exactly what we've been talking about, giving people tools. And in fact, the 5 Ds of intervention, which are 5 tools that folks can use exactly as you said. If I'm witnessing sexual harassment, so I'm witnessing catcalls, someone being followed, or I'm witnessing, xenophobia or transphobia, the same tenets of the tools apply. And so it's really important for folks to seize this opportunity that they have, which is 60-minute training at home, in your gym jams, eating your snacks. The cameras and microphones are turned off. It's very chill. And in an hour, you can learn the skills to literally transform your community. And I think as we're thinking about this new normal and getting back out into the world, it's up to all of us to really think about, what do I want that normal to look like? And frankly, do I want that normal to be in which folks of color and women are targeted when they leave their houses? I would hope not. But if that's the vibe, if that's what you're thinking, then it's a matter of you taking the time to learn the skills so that you can create that community care.
Julie, we're going to be talking with Angela White in about an hour from now from the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, and we'll be talking more about a vote in the House of Commons yesterday, somewhat of a remarkable result in that vote when it comes to the demand that the federal government drop its legal fight against Indigenous children, and that's leading the headlines, but also another story running parallel as you have a nation aghast at the discovery of these 215 bodies outside this former residential school in Kamloops, young kids, the sentencing of a man in Thunder Bay, Ontario, sentenced to 8 years for manslaughter for throwing a trailer hitch at an Indigenous woman. The injuries that she sustained, she ultimately succumbed to those injuries and died about 5 months later. Couldn't help but note the parallel storylines running there and the ongoing violence that Indigenous women and girls, Black and Indigenous women of color, continue to experience in Canada and across the country. Do you think that incidents, I don't want to say an incident, discoveries, grisly discoveries like in Kamloops, and I know that the nation is bracing itself for more, do you think that these can, in a way, turn the tide when it comes to members of the public and intervening in acts of violence? I mean, this throwing the trailer hitch at this woman in Thunder Bay is one incident, but we've received a flood of messages from people that are talking about, the racist attitudes that they realized that they carried as young people, as part of their upbringing or as part of their surroundings, and people are waking up in a way. Can you see public attitudes changing?
Certainly. I want to, echo what Indigenous folks have been saying, which is if folks had read the Truth and Reconciliation final report in 2005, they would have read an over 100-page long chapter about unmarked graves, and they would have known that. So I understand why a lot of Indigenous folks are pissed, because it's like this conversation is happening 6 years too late. But I agree with you, whether you're looking at George Floyd, whether you're looking at what happened with the discovery in Kamloops, that horrific case in Thunder Bay, what happened in London on Sunday. The reality is if we can seize those moments and turn them into concrete change, then yes, I think it can be quite powerful. But I think we need to recognize that it says a lot, that we need, and I say we as privileged people who are not impacted directly, that we need some sort of horrific concrete example in order to care. I think says a lot about our limited perspective on who is deserving of care in our communities and in our lives. But I do think that if we choose to move beyond just recounting horrific stories and give people tools to change the culture, then I think we can harness a moment. And I think that's what, folks like myself are trying to do right now, which is if you're horrified that folks who are read as people of color or read as queer or read as Muslim feel unsafe in their communities, like, what are you going to do about it? And frankly, posting a square on social media isn't enough. And I think, like I said, right now, while we have this opportunity where we're literally on the cusp of just about to be out and about in the world again, now is the time to learn those skills so you can put them into practice once we get out and about in the world.
Let me ask you this before we thank you for your time. You contributed to this collection, Sick of the System, Why the COVID-19 Recovery Must Be Revolutionary. Can you tell us about your contribution and where your head's at as we prepare? I don't want to get ahead of myself, but with cautious optimism as we prepare to sort of reemerge from this year and a half hibernation in a way?
Yeah, for me, it was important that people recognize that we have been living multiple pandemics. So last year in Canada was one of the deadliest years ever for women. So compared to 2019, we actually had significantly more women who were killed. So we had more femicide victims last year than the year prior. And that shook a lot of people because they thought, well, we've been in our houses, but the most unsafe place for a woman is in her own home. And so it's important for folks to really think about, again, this idea that, we just all stay home. Well, who gets to stay home? Who gets to stay home safely? And how many women are living situations of violence right now, and nobody knows because we don't check in with people in the same way because we are so isolated. And so, again, I want privileged people who've maybe been isolated for the first time in their lives throughout the course of the pandemic and who felt fear leaving their house for the first time because of the pandemic, to really think about the people in their lives who are not safe in their homes and who are unsafe whenever they leave their house. And it has nothing to do with COVID and everything to do with, misogyny, racism, et cetera. So that is, for me, what I really want folks to think about is I don't want to go back to the normal that we had before, because the normal before was a woman killed every 2.5 days. And that's not okay by me. So we have to make a concerted effort to say, what is the new normal going to look like? And it needs to be different than 2019.
When you wrote Resilience is Futile and released it, I mean, it's a remarkable, what do I say, like an expression of courage. I mean, it's your personal story, the life and death and life of Julie S. Lalonde, your personal experience dealing with a stalker for more than 10 years. The response to that, I would imagine, I mean, you must have thousands of people that personally have connected to that. How have you processed some of the feedback you've received, and what does that look like?
Well, thank you for that lovely feedback. And yeah, it's been really overwhelming, in particular because I launched my book the day the pandemic was declared. So I had one book tour, like one day of book launch, and then my tour was canceled. And so it meant that I heard from folks almost easier because they were emailing me and they would see me. And so I was absolutely flooded with stories of people, particularly because we don't talk about stalking in Canada. And yet we know it impacts a significant amount of people. We know it is a precursor to homicide. We know it's lethal, but it's just not talked about. And so I'm grateful that I was given the opportunity to break the silence on this form of violence. But it's so eerie to be hearing stories from people who are being targeted from this and who are stuck in their homes, which makes it more dangerous for them because their stalker knows where they are at all times and knows they're online at all times. And so it's been a very overwhelming experience. I'm grateful that folks trust me with their story. But, in many ways, I wish I was the only person that had this story because it is so demoralizing to know that this happened to me and it's happening to thousands of people across the country every day. And it's not getting the attention it deserves. And I really don't know what it's going to take. We had Me Too. We had the Gomeshi conversation. We've had so many conversations, and yet victims of stalking are still not getting the spotlight they deserve, frankly.
I mean, it's such a powerful piece, and I mean, you just said it so well. It's like it's one of those scenarios where, I mean, what you're providing here for us right now is such an important reality check. It's so encouraging to know that people are talking about it and finding support and community and educating themselves, bystanders included. At the same time, obviously, what word do you want to use? Demoralizing, heartbreaking, so incredibly troubling that's the necessity, that's the reality right now.
Absolutely. And so I really, again, want folks to think about how we are normalizing mental health check-ins right now during the pandemic. We're normalizing talking openly about not being okay and trying to juggle, being a parent with being an employee and doing all of those things. And it's important for us to maintain that post-pandemic.
Yeah.
Like, keep checking in on folks, because there are people who are really good at faking looking well, who are terrified in their homes, who are unsafe in their home. And one of the things I want us to maintain post-pandemic about the last year is normalizing checking in on folks and just making sure that we understand that not everyone's doing okay all the time. And community is essential to our survival as human beings. And I think that is one of the biggest lessons we have learned over the last year. When folks are taken away from their communities, they lose so much. And it's important for us to think about that moving forward. How do we create community, and how do we make it safe for everyone to be out and about in the world?
It's interesting, as you said, normalizing mental health check-ins. I just think there's so much wisdom to that, and I can't even show it on our screen because I've just grabbed it as my friend Meredith had this on her Instagram story. So it's within the last 24 hours that she posted this, but you reminded me of her message, which just says it's okay if you feel anxious about restrictions ending, if you don't want to return to work, if you gained weight in lockdown, if you're still worried about getting ill, if you feel anxious about socializing, or if you feel under pressure to make plans, you are not alone. And I just kind of went,
absolutely.
Huh.
Yeah, very much. There's a lot of people for whom getting out of their house is safety for them right now, and they desperately need to. And there are a lot of folks who have reasons to be afraid to be out and about again, and who don't feel ready to just transition to, we're back to normal. And I think that's why it's so important for us to talk about what is the new normal going to look like. And I think it needs to have hybrid models. And I think we need to be patient with folks who have lots of reasons for being freaked out about what's going on. And it doesn't mean that they're happy that the pandemic happened. But we have to be intentional about creating community and what we want that to look like. So if here in Ontario, we're lifting restrictions this week. I know folks in Alberta, restrictions are lifting, and that can be exciting for some folks and scary for others. So exactly like you said, just normalize meeting people where they're at.
Julie S. Lalonde, public educator, author of a contributor to Sick of the System, author of Resilience is Futile, The Life and Death of Julie S. Lalonde. Grateful for your time and your expertise today. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Make sure you give Julie a follow on Twitter as well, at Julie S. Lalonde. I've been following her for a long time, and she's got some great perspectives there. I appreciate the conversations that have been going on. We were really getting into some fascinating stuff there, and so I'll be honest, I wasn't keeping a keen eye on the live chat, other to note that it's been absolutely churning this morning, and I know that there are a lot of conversations here and important conversations to have. Of course, we've broadened the discussion with Julie Lalonde there, but the point here, the starting point of this story is this horror out of London, Ontario. This family absolutely and permanently torn apart with the cold-blooded mass murder of four family members. A grandmother and mother, obviously, parents, a mom and dad in their 40s, and their 15-year-old girl gone. Their daughter, the son, this 9-year-old boy who the entire country, I think, is thinking of right now. I don't know if I don't think you need to believe in God to say a prayer or to put energy out into the universe or whatever you do to express the anguish and grief that you feel, the empathy that you feel for this young man. I don't even know what to say about this 9-year-old boy who, first of all, has some serious physical injuries to recover from, and then I don't know how you characterize what the rest of his life will look like, except to say that this entire country needs to be here for this young man in many ways, shapes, and forms. I heard an imam, a spiritual leader, a Muslim leader out of London, speaking yesterday, just very almost not cold. That's not the right word. Numb is probably one of the words. Just absolute shock on his face, describing the very early stages of trying to offer these community supports. I don't know where you begin. I do want to note Mustafa Farouk of the National Council of Canadian Muslims has been in touch with us. He sent his apologies. We had him confirmed out of the top of the show. He says, we have an emergency meeting. He says, I have to go. Obviously understandable. We're doing this live. You know, this isn't a recorded podcast in the sense that we piece it together with interviews through the day. So we'll either have Mustafa on later in the broadcast today. He'll either join us today, which is what we're hoping for, obviously, or if not, he'll be joining us tomorrow. And you can always be in touch with us as well to talk at ryanjesperson.com. We're going to cover some other news of the day. As mentioned, my conversation with Angela White of the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. She'll be joining us, Angela will, in about 45 minutes from now. And in about 2 minutes, we're going to talk to the mayors of Lethbridge and High River. You remember the last time that His Worship Mayor Craig Snodgrass was on the show, the mayor of High River. He actually got gift, or did he get gift? His performance here had all of you going, whoa! And Chris Spearman, I know the mayor of Lethbridge, also has been a good friend of this show, and I know these two are all ready to go to talk about this new Alberta Coal Restriction Policy. Somebody send up fireworks and strobes and let everybody know that we're talking about coal again on Real Talk. The last time we did, we saw how Albertans feel very clearly about protecting their parks. That's coming up in just a second. I wanted to remind you right now, it feels like a perfect time to talk to you about Eden Landscaping. If you want to get that sort of reality around you that feels like you're out maybe in the back country, maybe you're looking for some mature trees, they can bring those in. You know, not every landscaping project has to start with these little itty bitty saplings. They've got a team that's experienced and ready to go, dropping in trees, bushes, shrubs of all sizes. You want an immediate privacy solution? Eden Landscaping figures that stuff out. Their team's been doing this for more than 20 years. You can check out their work at landscapeedmonton.ca. Sam, are you able to fire me up that video as well from our friends at Grand Dog Essentials? For the Real Talkers that are joining us on YouTube, check this out, and I'll describe it for our friends tuning into the podcast. Oh, by the way, thanks. The other day, we hit our 1,000,000th download. Thanks to everybody that downloads our podcast. We really appreciate it. Check this out. This is from the Grand Dog Essentials Instagram. You got to follow it. This is their beef veggie puree with the green egg joint supplement. Okay, these are the supplements that their nutritionists can, recommend for your pup depending on what your pup needs. Look at these good doggos. They're loving their quality raw food from Grand Dog Essentials. If you go to granddog.ca right now, use the promo code REALTALK. They'll give you 10% off your first time order, and of course they deliver right to your door if you're in Calgary, Edmonton, or the Red Deer area. More details at granddog.ca. Well, it's been a while since we've spoken about coal on this show, specifically coal mining, open pit mining in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in southern Alberta. It was a conversation that dominated the headlines several months ago, and it hasn't gone away. It's just the news cycle can be fleeting and fickle, but work continues behind the scenes, including, by the way, exploratory work up in those mountain ranges. It's caught the attention of environmental activists, concerned citizens, and, of course, politicians at the different levels of government. That includes the mayor of High River, His Worship Craig Snodgrass, the mayor of Lethbridge, His Worship Chris Spearman, who joined us live this morning. Mayors, welcome back to the show, and thanks for being here. Mayor Snodgrass, why don't we kick it off with you? Tell us about this Alberta Coal Restriction Policy. This is going to be news to a lot of people.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ryan. This is important. And, this came from my discussions with the Coal Policy Committee when I met with them on April 27th, I guess it was. And what Chair Wallace was very clear about, he said, after I did my big spiel and everything, he said, can you just write down in clear words exactly what you want to see, what the town of High River wants to see happen? And, there's this big conversation about all this government to government and, would I be managing all this government to government consultations kind of separately? But that got a little bit overwhelming. And so we agreed that just, write down what you want and send it out to the municipalities and see who else is interested in signing on that and endorsing our policy. So when I got looking at it, everybody's been talking about we need a new modern coal policy. And I'm like, well, that's not what Albertans are asking for. They want no coal. So let's have a coal restriction policy as to how these restrictions go. So that's where we put this together and then sent it out to all the municipalities, rural, urban, as well as the First Nations. They all received this, and we're starting to get the feedback now. So that's where it came from. That's where it happened.
So one of the municipalities that signed on was Lethbridge, right, Mayor Spearman?
That's correct.
Why is that? What was it that prompted you to sign on?
Well, Mayor Snodgrass presented to the Southwest Mayors and Reeves. There's about 40 municipalities in Southwest Alberta. And we listened to that. I took the message back to the Lethbridge City Council. And at our last council meeting, I brought forward the resolution to support one policy that erases all the categories as proposed by Mayor Snodgrass, and secondly, that reclamation for existing exploration be completed by 2025. So our council supported that unanimously, and I think that reflects what the majority of residents in Southwest Alberta and in the city of Lethbridge believe. That's the practical side of it, and the emotional side of it is that many of us, on our weekends, on our time off, we're spending time in the mountains, and we don't want to see restricted access to areas that we've been using for years, and we don't want to see the area damaged. The practical side of what we're saying in the city of Lethbridge is our whole economy is based on agriculture. Agriculture depends on water. We need to have clean water, and it cannot be contaminated with selenium or anything else, any of the byproducts of the coal mining. And, we've got a massive $140 billion investment in irrigation, in agricultural development, and in agricultural processing. So it's really important that we continue to protect those assets. They already exist. And most Albertans are saying the economic benefits of coal mining just are not worth it. The mountains mean too much to us. Fresh water means too much to us. Fresh air means too much to us. And so I think the actions that municipalities are taking are reflective of what we've seen in the polls that have been conducted. Albertans value the mountains, they value fresh water, and they value access to the mountains over coal mining.
Mayor Snodgrass, is there any sort of a binding power to this? I mean, what would be the implications if every municipality in Alberta signed on?
Well, what's going to happen is whoever endorses this, we've got a number of them now, and I'm just going to take that list back to the Coal Policy Committee as part of our recommendation as to what should be done for the future of this going forward in Alberta, specifically to the eastern slopes. But and then hopefully that will form what, the recommendations that the committee is going to be taking back to Alberta Energy, the Alberta government, Minister Savage, to give them their recommendation as to where coal mining's future sits in this province. So, binding, absolutely not. There's nothing binding, but it all comes down to government decision at the end of the day. So,
Mayor Spearman, you sounded like you wanted to chime in there.
No, I think what I was concerned about is some of the feedback from the Alberta government that water is not an issue, and people commenting on water, it's not relevant. And wow, that's probably the biggest issue we have in the city of Lethbridge.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, mayors, I'm not sure that anybody believes anything that the Alberta government's saying on coal right now, or the implications of mining, or protecting parks, or protecting water, or protecting the air, and quite frankly, I think you'd have to be an idiot right now to trust the government on any of those fronts. But what did this tell you, Mayor Spearman, the pushback from citizens? Lethbridge, Southern Alberta, like you said, regionally, people are going to have different concerns. There's going to be different things on people's radar. Somebody in Grand Prairie might have different concerns than somebody in Cardston or Tabor or whatever the case may be. How would you characterize, you're a seasoned politician in the autumn of your career, as my dad would put it. How has this resonated with you as opposed to other issues that have raised the public's ire?
Well, if I to start with being towards the end of my career, I think my legacy, if there is one, would be to say, I did my best on my watch to protect the assets that we have in Alberta and keep them for future generations. I think it's important to do that. When I'm in the mountains, I'm there with my family, with my kids and my grandkids. And I think we all appreciate the beauty of the mountains and what we have. And maybe some Albertans take it for granted, but what I'm really encouraged by is the feedback on the public opinion polls that have been done, where the vast majority of Albertans say the mountains are too important to us to damage them with coal mining. So, I fully appreciate there are some communities, like in the Crow's Nest Pass, and you could have the mayor of the Crow's Nest Pass on another day. I know his council split on the issue, but certainly there are many in the Crow's Nest Pass who think coal mining is important and they need something to bring the economy back in that area. But most Albertans are saying that's not worth it. There must be something else we can do that's less environmentally damaging. And, the life of these gold mines is 20 to 30 years. That's a blip in the history of the Rocky Mountains and the fresh water. And the last thing we want is lasting damage to our environment and our water supply.
We will reach out to Mayor Blair Painter out of Crow's Nest Pass. That's a great suggestion. Mayor Snodgrass, what have you, when it comes to this, I think a lot of people right now are going to be like, oh, they're talking about coal on Real Talk, and there's a whole bunch of other things going on, right? You've got violence in the Middle East. We have this devastation, this racist, this hate crime in London, Ontario. We've got the story of reconciliation across Canada. Why are we talking about coal right now? And I think that some people may have been led to believe over the past couple of months that everything ground to a halt, that all the Save Alberta Parks lawn signs kind of rolled in and saved the day and that nobody has anything to worry about anymore. But that's not exactly the case, is it?
No, unfortunately, this is just another major issue that we're dealing with. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We have a long list of serious issues that we're all dealing with. And but this coal discussion, I even had a reporter from somewhere that I won't give him a plug, right? Got in trouble for that last time. So
you can plug some outlets on here, Mayor, just not others.
So they were asking me, they said, well, somebody brought this up. I thought this was all done. And I'm like, no, it's not all done. Just because they rewound the policy and put the old 76 policy back in play. And just because we've got a pause, that's all it is a pause on the exploration. Just because we have that, we are so far away from being done and having an actual conversation about this as to where we're headed that, the Coal Policy Committee has, this is a monstrous task that they've taken on. And all of the individuals that are involved with it, they're all heroes for us for taking this on. And Chair Wallace the guy's hardcore, and he is not going to screw around with this or let the government push him around and the committee around with this. So it's just another one on the list, unfortunately, Ryan, that we have to get, because if we do not get this done and coal mining is allowed to proceed, there will be the harmful effects of coal mining. It exists in every single coal mine, selenium contamination, and of course, the destruction of the landscapes. It's just the way it is. And those you cannot rewind. Atrum Coal came and, they presented to us, and we were pretty clear with where we were at with them, but last week they came to Foothills County, to their council, and had a chat with them. And Foothills County did an excellent job in really grilling them on, you know, what are you doing about the water? What are you doing about the selenium? And they had no answers. They've got some cool graphics that somebody put together for them. They didn't spend a lot of money on it, but you know, what they're saying is, well, we have advanced technology that hasn't been used in the past and all these things, and you know, it's different than the historical stuff that's gone on. You know, and the question is, well, what is that? Well, it's a pond. So, you know, sorry, but they have been used in the past. They have failed in the past. And if that's the new technology that they're coming up with, we need to be very, very concerned. And the more that Foothills County pressured them on it, the weaker their response came back to it. You know, even to the question, well, do your ponds have to be lined? And Atrim said, well, you know, we'll line them if we have to, I guess. Well, if somebody's going to make them line them, well, selenium leaches, that's the problem. So if they're not lined and you don't have that in your technology already, you know, they keep talking about how great their scientists are and everything that are working on all this new technology, but they haven't even got to that stage. And they follow all of it up with, you know, these are all just conceptual plans. So there is absolutely no plan for a new coal mine company or an old one to deal with selenium properly. It does not exist. It's snake oil. Unfortunately, the government was sold on it that this was going to happen. Our MLA is sold on it. Our MP is sold on it. I think all MLAs are sold on this right now. But so that's why we got to keep pressuring onto this thing and telling them the answer is no. The risks are far too high. Chris said it very, very well. To existing businesses, you know, the number of jobs that coal will bring in, you compare that to what's going to be lost if we lose our water. And the agribusiness, especially down south, we've got our own up here, but you know, immediately it's a big threat down in that Lethbridge area as to what's going to go on if we get contamination, because once you have it, you don't rewind it. And we are not willing to take that risk, period.
I mean, you say that, you know, all MLAs are sort of towing the government's line on this one. If I'm understanding correctly what you're saying, I don't know how much longer that'll be the case, Mayor. Like I see, I mean, you've got, you know, Richard Godfried, who's been a loyal, you know, representative, resigning as chair of the Calgary caucus, you know, not to mention, you know, I mean, obviously we've had a couple of MLAs booted out of caucus. You know, you've had Minister Leela here speak out and demand that the Premier apologize. You're starting to see kind of cracks in that foundation a little bit. I'll get to you in a second, Mayor Spearman, but I can't ignore Snodgrass. You're kind of rolling your eyes a little bit. I just, what about what I'm saying is inaccurate, or what am I stirring up within you?
Oh, no, it's all accurate. That's the problem, right? It just keeps going. It's on and on and on with this group. And,
so then that leads me to believe that why in the hell would an elected representative in their right mind? We all know this is not nobility that's prompting them all to step forward. It's because their constituents are telling them that they will not reelect them unless they speak out. That's why they're signing these letters. That's why they're saying these things. That's why they're sticking their necks out for the first time in a long time. What MLA, what MP for that matter, in their right mind would go to the wall to endorse the most unpopular economic initiative this government has rolled out in its brief history? And I would challenge anybody on that point.
Well, it's all a reflection, in my mind, it's all a reflection of what your inner integrity is all about. And in my words, with the way I reflect on integrity is choosing to do what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy, or politically favorable to you with the Premier. You know, we have yet to have a single MLA really take a stand against this. RJ Sigurdsson out of Highwood is the only one that's really said anything, and he spoke to rewinding the policy. That was it. But, you know, and kudos to him for doing that. But as far as really sticking their necks out, no, they'll do it for COVID, but nobody's done it. not one MLA has really taken a stand against coal mining to reflect the will of their constituents, which is their actual job. That's not taking place. Somebody's got to start it.
Mayor Spearman, have you ever, I'm putting you on the spot here, have you ever eaten at Roy's Place restaurant? Are you familiar with this restaurant?
It's on the way up. It's on Highway 2. Sure.
Okay. I keep hearing about this place, and is it cinnamon buns that made him famous? There's something that made him famous that was really speaking my language. I think it might have been cinnamon buns. I don't remember, but Keith Carlson is the owner and the chef there. He was on You Gotta Eat Here, that great culinary show. Mayor Spearman's wondering, where in the hell is Jesperson going with this? Keith is watching the show today, and his tweet caught my attention because he used the hashtag RealTalkRJ, and because his Twitter bio names him as the next MLA for Livingstone McLeod, which would lead me to believe that he believes that maybe he'll be. That's your riding, wouldn't it be, Mayor, or a riding right near to where you are?
That would be Mayor Snodgrass, right?
Livingstone McLeod would be your riding. Pardon me. Yeah, you'd be either Phillips or I can't remember. That's bad. I can't remember the
Nathan Newdorf.
Thank you, Newdorf. That's right. You've got the split there. Lethbridge has equal representation in Lethbridge. Pardon me. So Mayor Snodgrass, maybe he'll be your next MLA. But he says I'm wondering if you get the mayor on record asking about Roger Reed's involvement. That's the MLA. About his communication as the MLA of the area involved. Have you reached out to MLA Reed? Have you had specific correspondence with him? I would imagine the answer is yes.
Well played politically, right? Yeah, absolutely. I have in the first couple of months or so. But Roger is a good man, but he's caught with this one. He is in support of the coal mines right now. He has yet to say otherwise, and unfortunately, that's just the way it is.
Yeah, but so not to state the obvious though, but when you've got two elected officials at different levels of government, and one of them is spearheading this initiative to get other municipalities signing on to the coal restriction policy, and then the MLA representing the same constituents in the same area is going to the wall to support the mining. I mean, that to me implies that one of you, either you or him, are directly ignoring the best interests of your constituents.
Yeah, it isn't me. So that's just too clear. Roger has been very close with the Crow's Nest community, going back to the election, very close. And this coal thing was kept very, very quiet in the last election.
Sure was.
By all parties, right? It was just silent. I'll tell you right now, that is not going to happen in the next election, and the next election is going to take place prior to any of these projects proceeding. So everybody needs to start paying attention to what's going on, and that's why the municipalities have, I thought, I've been challenged a lot, this is overstepping your municipal government boundaries. Bullshit. No, it's not. This affects my community, and that's what we are all about, exactly what Mayor Spearman was talking about too, that there are no boundaries on this one. This is ridiculous that we got snake oiled, or our government got snake oiled into this plan, and we're not putting up with it. If our MLAs, if our MPs won't do it for us, we'll take it on ourselves. We will let Alberta, or let the government know what Albertans think. And we've got the town of Tofield, the town of Grimshaw, the town of Staveley, village of Warburg, Lethbridge County, city of Lethbridge, town of Vegreville, and of course, town of High River. Those are all the ones that have given us signed endorsements right now, as well as, for our direct coal restriction policy. There's also a number of communities that are kind of sitting on the fence, right? And that's concerning to me. And I know a lot of these individuals, and in talking with them, some of them are just flat out scared of repercussions from the provincial government if they go against the government's wish. And I said the last interview, Ryan, that if that's where we're at, that our municipalities are afraid to take a stand on something for fear of retribution on a certain project or a grant or something, that is a disaster in this province, and that is not what we are about. We talk about issues, we deal with issues one at a time. We don't combine them with your swimming pool, whether you need the grant for it, and you're not going to say anything about coal mining because you're worried about your grant for your swimming pool. Those are two separate conversations. So, there's only one community that has supported the coal mining and supported the pass, and that's the town of Vulcan. Their council was, I think, 3-3 or 4-3 to not support our letter. The town of Nanton, they had a discussion about it yesterday. They are deferring any decision to June 21st. Town of Okotoks, they just received our letter as information. They didn't want to take a stand on it. I don't know where it'll go in the future, if anywhere. Town of Canmore, directly in these areas, the town of Canmore, we got a letter back from them stating they didn't have time to deal with it.
What?
Yeah. So, the town of Rocky Mountain House, they didn't, directly endorse our restriction policy, but they did send us a letter, and which is going to Jason Nixon, Minister Savage, everybody, right? So, and they're saying that Rocky Mountain House believes that a transparent, accountable, collaborative, and regulatory approach that is subject to extensive consultation, environmental consideration, cost-benefit analysis, and review of regulatory processes and regulations will ultimately lead to the best decision regarding these proposed developments. All of that is not going to be met with this coal mining. The history should tell us more than enough than what we need. But the biggest thing I wanted to get out is that the residents of Alberta need to, forget the MLAs. It's a waste of time. Get to your municipal governments and challenge them to at least get our document onto a meeting, have the conversation, and talk about it and make a decision as to which way you're going to go on it. This is extremely important and needs to take place. So that's just where we're at. But
It'll be interesting to see. I'm a little blown away by Canmore's response, but I have a lot to learn about the way that jurisdictions vote, right? I mean, I've never, to be fair to Banff Kananaskis MLA Miranda Rosen, I've never interviewed her personally. I've only read interviews that she's done, but it was always wild to me. You'd picture, like, if you were just making assumptions, and you know what they say about people that do, but you might assume that you'd think Banff Kananaskis or Banff Canmore might have kind of one of these granola chewing, Birkenstock wearing hippie type legislative representatives, but Miranda Rosen was actually, one of the ones that was speaking quite openly against COVID protocols, masking protocols, et cetera. So I've always got a lot to learn about understanding how jurisdictions vote. Don't get me started on how Alberta votes provincially, then federally. Look at Edmonton, right? Edmonton, absolutely bizarre. Provincially will go all but one. They'll vote NDP all but one. They send one UCP MLA to the legislature, and then in the federal election, they'll go all but one Conservative, right? And send one NDP MP. I can never figure it out. It never makes sense. I will suggest this. 2 years is an eternity between now and the next election, if that's when it is. If April 2019 was the election, was the referendum on carbon tax, as it was described by then opposition leader Jason Kenney, I would humbly suggest that at this point, it's looking like 2023 might be a referendum on curriculum and coal. And I think it'll be interesting to see where Albertans are going to land on that in these different jurisdictions, most especially in the city of Calgary, which is going to be the huge swing, if you ask me, when it comes to 2023. Mayors, I know you have a lot to get to here during your day, but I want to ask you a couple of things. Has nothing to do with coal. Or at least probably very little to do with coal. Mayor Spearman, we spoke yesterday about the opioid crisis, which is undoubtedly an enormous issue in Alberta and British Columbia and across the country. We know that your city, Lethbridge, saw its funding pulled for arches. And as citizen journalist Kim Seaver was reporting yesterday, you've seen a doubling of opioid-related deaths in the past 3-month period as composed to the year before. How do you approach this as the mayor of Lethbridge?
probably the most tragic issue in our city. Really, we haven't dealt with the issue. We don't have the needed supports to help people who are in crisis. We don't have the supported housing. We don't have the needed treatment. When we lost the supervised consumption, we really lost connection with the majority of the users. So there is a smaller mobile trailer that people can access, but certainly the number of uses went down. And the challenge is, how do we fix this going forward? People are very concerned about drug-related crime, and addiction issues, side issues, homeless people living in our parks, and those types of things. But unless we can get a handle on the issue and have a strategy going forward, it's going to be a big problem. We've created a community well-being and safety strategy. We're involving businesses and people in the community in that to inform people about the issues, about the implications, and have the community come forward to us with some recommendations. We've had some unfortunate public hearings where supports for people with addiction were voted down. And, a lot of opposition, NIMBY type of opposition. And we're just nowhere in terms of dealing with the issue. No progress.
Nowhere, no progress. Mayor Snodgrass, how does it impact a smaller community, relatively speaking, like High River? Do you see it? Is it undeniable in your own community?
You're talking about the opioid.
Yeah.
Yeah, not on the level of as the bigger centers, but I have hands-on first experience with what happens when you with this crisis, and the reason is because I own a funeral home in High River. That's my real job, and we have a contract with the medical examiners in the coroner's office out of Calgary, so we do all the sudden death transfers. And yeah, I see it firsthand, and that was the importance of these supervised consumption sites, is that they were supervised, and these people that are struggling with these addictions were able to do it in a safe environment rather than in the basement of their home, and that's where, unfortunately, without them, that's where we end up is doing the transfers out of the basements of these homes. And it's very real, it's real in High River, especially after COVID hit. We had a little bit of a spike in this town because of all the CERB payments and the extra money that some of these individuals were able to access. And we had 3 sudden deaths in 1 week because of drug overdoses. And so that, I get where most people are blind to it. You don't see it in High River. It's because it's hidden. It's because these people have to resort to the basement, and the rest of people don't see it, so they don't understand it. But that's a horrible decision by our provincial government to defund that stuff.
In closing, I want to ask the two of you. I'll be speaking with Angela White from the Indian Residential School Survivors Society coming in about 15 minutes or so. Obviously, the entire nation, I think, is what do you say right now, is taking pause to try to process what elders and residential school survivors have been telling us existed for decades, for many, many years. And we're learning more about Canada's legacy, a deplorable and atrocious legacy of residential schools. We're talking about reconciliation, and the conversations are expanding to include many different approaches and many different discussions. And I think that if there's one thing that I'm encouraged by, it's that people at an individual level are starting to ask, what can I do? What do I need to do? And how am I going to apply what I'm feeling right now in my daily or in my personal life? As community leaders, Mayor Spearman, how are you processing what we've discovered, so to speak, a couple of weeks ago? What are you hearing from your community members, and how is it impacting people in and around the city of Lethbridge, including nearby Indigenous communities?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. We've had a Reconciliation Lethbridge Advisory Committee in place for about 4 years now, who've been giving us good advice. And one of the things we've tried to do is to work with Indigenous people and get their input and advice on issues like this. And I think that's going to help us going forward. There's a lot of people that want to do something immediate. And the worst thing I think we can do as non-Indigenous people is do something that we think will help. And what they've told us in these meetings is don't do anything about us without us. In other words, consult us. So we're in a listening phase at the moment. We're saying, okay, what things can we do locally to improve? And they can't just be symbolic. People are suggesting we change the name of Indian Battle Park, which is the big park in the river valley at Lethbridge. We have a subdivision called Indian Battle Heights. The flag for the city of Lethbridge is the flag from Fort Whoop-Up. Fort Whoop-Up was a whiskey trading post that took advantage of Indigenous people, trading them whiskey for Indigenous goods and creating all kinds of complications and harm for addictions long term. So there are some opportunities there, but we don't really want to do anything unless the Indigenous people themselves and their elders, with the support of their elders, make recommendations. We're not going to just sort of say, this is a disaster. It's a tragedy. This is what happened in Kamloops. And we know that we're right beside the largest Indigenous reserve in Canada, the Blackfoot Blood Reserve. And these types of issues have happened here. At our last city council meeting, we had Elder Leroy Littlebear, who is a professor at the University of Lethbridge, come and speak to us on how we can respond to this terrible tragedy in Kamloops and what the local history has been. So there are people who are scarred locally, but the important thing is to listen to the Indigenous people and help them guide us. How can we reconcile our relationship? How can we reconcile our history? And one other thing we're doing, and we were doing it prior to the news of this tragedy, is we have negotiated a memorandum of understanding with the Blood Tribe. And it's based on 4 points. And certainly we want to work with them. Our city motto, that's behind me in Latin, it means gateway to opportunity. And I say it means gateway to opportunity for everyone, for immigrants, for refugees, for our Indigenous people, and everyone who lives in the city of Lethbridge should have the same opportunities when it comes to housing, when it comes to employment. And we need to solve problems we've had here for decades: racism, discrimination. Those things we have to address. And until we get past those, then there's no quick fixes, but it's to create community understanding that the most important thing we can do is develop a positive relationship with our Indigenous people. A couple of years ago, we adopted the Blackfoot word "oki" as the official greeting for the city of Lethbridge, and that means welcome in Blackfoot, and welcome to all. So we have to have relationships based on respect. We need to make sure that everybody's participating in the prosperity that is Southern Alberta. And we need to work with each other to make sure that everyone is benefiting. And we have work to do.
Mayor Snodgrass, one of Alberta's 25 former residential schools was St. Joseph's in High River. I wonder how much the average person knows that. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to bullshit anybody. I wouldn't have even been able to say 25. I wouldn't have been able to tell you where they were until I sought out that information recently, and I've been trying to learn a little bit more. I've been trying to learn a lot more, quite frankly, but enough to be having informed conversations that are moving us forward here. How are the people of High River processing this, and what's your community doing about it?
So St. Joseph's, also known as Dunbow Industrial School, or it was known as the High River Industrial School. It's straight east of Okotoks, actually, on the banks of the Highwood River, just before it meets the Bow. And, it's a similar on a smaller scale, but a similar thing happened about 10 years ago, where the discovery of about 25 graves of children that perished at that school were found because of the flood in 1996. Eroded the bank enough that it exposed some of the caskets. That's how it was discovered. And, you know, there was a reburial ceremony and everything. And there's a great YouTube video that the kids of Strathcona Tweedsmuir did on it. But I'll tell you what, here's where I'm at with it. I'm very close with residents of Eden Valley Reserve west of High River here, and because of the funeral work I do. And I knew about the Dunbow School, I knew about that, but I tell you what, I had no understanding at all as to that was a residential school, and what we're learning now about the residential schools, like this is, it's really overwhelming to really learn as to what this stuff was all about. And I think that's where the majority of the population is they're getting woken up as to what this was all about. And fortunately, you know, High River is a member of the Calgary Metropolitan Region Board, which is the city of Calgary and the 9 municipalities, urban and rural, that surround the city of Calgary. And last week, we just started our Indigenous awareness workshops, and there's 4 or 5 of them, if I remember right, and led by some quality individuals. And the first meeting that we had last week, I tell you what, I came away from that absolutely overwhelmed, going, you know, what do we do? How do we, you know, how do you even begin to write this thing? And, you know, Mayor Spearman, they've been dealing with it longer than, you know, Little High River has. But it's important that all of our communities do start to get involved. And, you know, even since then, we've been working with our First Nations groups on another project, but and we're having a meeting tomorrow about that I'm involved with, and I'm going to be bringing up a lot of this stuff as to, you know, what do we do, how do we do it, and how do we try to start to make some of this right. But Chris nailed it on the head that it's, you know, nothing about us without us, and that's directly from the First Nations. And that's where we start, is that, you know, we can't just go doing all our symbolic things without involving the First Nations group and making sure they have the voice as to where we're headed with this. So yeah, an enormous amount of work to do yet, but it's overwhelming. That's the only word I can come up with it right now.
Yeah. I appreciate your candor, mayors, and for taking those questions. I appreciate the work that you continue to do. I've got somebody asking me here, Craig, and I don't know the answer. Mayor Spearman, we know that you've announced that you will not seek re-election. Mayor Snodgrass, have you decided whether or not you will?
Yeah, what the hell? I'm having fun.
Yeah. Is that an exclusive?
Yeah, I knew you were going to poke that one. That's the first.
Well, of course I am. This is how we get exclusives. And so Sarah Hoyles will push that out right now, that exclusively, as announced on Real Talk, High River's mayor, High River's popular mayor, Craig Snodgrass, will seek re-election. We appreciate you letting us know. Let me tell you this in closing. Country music superstar and environmental activist Corb Lund is among the members of our live audience this morning. He says, after watching this coal thing develop over the last year, it feels to me like the government's counting on Albertans either being under the impression that the coal issue's been resolved or that the public just gets burned out on it. This is a long fight, and we can't take the pressure off. We've seen some really impressive results in terms of getting the government's attention, but we have to keep pushing. He says, Craig Snodgrass is my kind of mayor. He's right about the fact that we can't let the government get away with this because we only have one shot. Once the government's contaminated and our grandkids will be dealing with it, once the Rockies are torn up, it's impossible. He says, keep pushing, folks. And kudos to Mayors Spearman and Snodgrass for standing up to these people. That from Corb Lund. I'll echo his gratitude, and thanks for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Yeah, Corb's another hero, so he's doing an excellent job. Thanks very much for keeping the conversation going, Ryan.
You bet, fellas, and thanks for reaching out. That's the mayor of High River, His Worship Craig Snodgrass, the mayor of Lethbridge, His Worship Chris Spearman. You can let us know what you think about what you've just heard. Obviously, the conversation on coal will continue. Real Talk's been proud to have been driving a lot of that conversation because you, the most engaged media audience in Western Canada, demand it and expect it of us, and we're grateful for that. You can always send us an email to talk@ryanjesperson.com. Brenda says Craig should be backed by Jespo. If Brenda's talking about an official endorsement, consider it done. I will go on the record. This is my first official endorsement for the 2021 fall municipal elections in the province of Alberta. I officially endorse the incumbent mayor of High River, Craig Snodgrass. You can stamp it. You can put that down. For all that matter, you can draw it with your finger into wet concrete and let it dry. Snap a photo and tell your friends in High River that Craig Snodgrass deserves re-election. We're going to get to some of your comments coming up in just a moment about our so-called lead story. I hate calling it that. It's a really brutal way to describe it, but it's the story that Canadians... Can you believe it? You know, it feels like it... What's it been over the past couple of years, the past few years, where I say this is the lead story? No, that's a lousy way to put it. This is the story that has Canadians absolutely appalled. And then you go, well, which one? It's just that kind of a news cycle right now. I'm talking about the mass murder of virtually an entire family, a 9-year-old boy surviving an attack, a 20-year-old man in custody facing 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 of attempted murder after a family was targeted. Police say based on their ethnicity or their religion, they're calling it a hate crime. Investigators at different levels are cooperating to determine whether or not terrorism-related charges are appropriate. We're going to get to your comments on that. Mustafa Farouk, the CEO of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, has sent his regrets in an emergency meeting, which is completely understandable today, as they work on their advocacy efforts and others, obviously providing community supports and other important supports at this time. I would imagine Mustafa will be on the show either later today. We can pull that audible. We can make that happen, no problem, or tomorrow morning. But we do want to give you a chance to take the floor. Also, in just a moment, I'll talk to Angela White of the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Yeah, I hate to put it like this, but that's another one of the stories that Canadians are appalled at right now and trying to wrap their minds around. These conversations, these difficult conversations, are made possible because we have a roster of Real Talk builders that not only keep us on the air, but allow us to continue to grow the depth of our coverage, grow the size of our team, etc. And that includes the team at Westworld Computers. Our studio is powered by Westworld Computers, and they can do the same for you, whether it's your home, whether it's your workplace. They've got the entire Mac lineup on offer like they have for the last 40 years. And don't forget about their service department. You can book an appointment right now at westworld.ca. They're absolutely customer focused, which means providing the best advice on what can be salvaged, refurbished, or maybe what's best to retire. If that's the case, remember they transfer the data from your old computer, your old device to the new one for free. It's all part of the customer service at westworld.ca. Our friends at the Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park, that's Palisades, Nemeo, Newcastle, Westmount, Y Gardens, and Baseline Road. Thank you for the mass outpouring of interest when it comes to those Jespo Special Peanut Buster Parfaits, those $1.99 ones. The offer is now closed, but that's because they're making way for the Father's Day Dairy Queen cake promotion. All you have to do, you show up, you mention Real Talk or Jespo, they're going to give you $5 off your Father's Day cake. Of course, you can order those in advance, or you can walk in and pick one up. They're also collecting donations for the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation at the Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. Also, a big shout out to the teams at Sherwood and St. Albert Dodge. Those Rams are in high demand this summer as everybody's looking for something to pull the boat, the trailer, or something to get them out into the backwoods. And of course, as you've been hearing here on the show, you know that selection right now is a bit of an issue. Any dealership's going to tell you that. There's a lot of factors at play, mostly these microchips. But Sherwood and St. Albert Dodge, in addition to their already impressive selection, are able to share their inventory so you get the best choice, whether you're looking for a half-ton, three-quarter, or a big one-ton hauler. You'll find the best selection of Ram at Sherwood and St. Albert Dodge. We'll get to Angela White in a moment. We wanted to reach out to our audience. We wanted to essentially provide an opportunity for our audience members to have a say here. We're grateful for those that join us live in our live chat on YouTube. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Of course, we're easy to find. Just search Real Talk Ryan Jesperson. Jake says regarding this attack on this family, the murder of these 4 family members in London, Ontario. Jake says, it really bothers me that these are called acts of violence. He says, call it what it is. It's terrorism. Tiana says, this is absolutely a terrorist act. This is a hate crime. Dwayne says, fear and hate aren't the same thing. This is an issue that's been popping up. The use of the phrase Islamophobia. And we've seen some prominent Muslim, and for that matter, non-Muslim voices, but the Muslim ones are the ones that matter most, quite frankly, in the context of this conversation, pushing back against the use of the word Islamophobia, right? Arachnophobia, the fear of spiders, Islamophobia. Well, spiders are kind of scary, right? If you have a fear of spiders, you have arachnophobia, right? Islamophobia. Well, what does that say about Muslims? It's a point, quite frankly, to be honest with you, I had not even considered until literally last night, like 12, 14 hours ago. And I'm reading these tweets, and all of a sudden it kind of hit me. I go, I've never even thought of that. It's not been on my radar. I hope that this is an exercise that happens to you as frequently as it does to me as we gather in community here on Real Talk every single morning. I feel like every day, or at least a couple times a week, there's this moment where you go, Dwayne making a good point. Fear and hate are not the same thing. You may say, well, what's the preferred vernacular? What about an anti-Muslim hate crime? That's what I've seen some of these community leaders propose. Some random guy says, when you decide one day that you can just run over a family with your truck because of their race or their religion, who's the one who's actually afraid here? Or who's the one who's actually scary here? Jillian says, again, notice how the Conservatives are behind the times, denying the impact of residential schools. We find bodies. What was it, 4 years ago, voting against that government bill calling out Islamophobia. Innocent Muslims murdered again, says Jillian. I'll look forward to speaking with voices, advocates and representatives and voices, and of course we will on the show in the days to come, about whether or not they think that votes like that out of the House of Commons would actually mean anything. I'm not getting anybody off the hook here. I'm just curious to know what the experts will say, community leaders, spiritual leaders will say would be actually effective legislation or action from elected officials. I'd be curious to know. Tiana says, the thing is, this has been brought up before. There's sort of a general comment of passively noting acts of violence and hate, and that allows them really to escalate. Eric says, when I was young, we used to make racist jokes, telling ourselves that it didn't harm anybody. We didn't hate anybody. We just had it hardwired that we were somehow better. And Eric says, now that I'm grown up, I feel sad about it. I appreciate that, Eric. What a conversation we had with Dr. Jody Carrington the other day. It's of all of the things that are, just to put it plainly, that are blowing up my mentions on social media. It's the people that continue to revisit that conversation with Dr. Jody Carrington. I think it was like last Thursday, right? Or something like that. It was like mid to late last week. And Dr. Carrington joined us and we talked about this, and we talked about processing anguish and grief and anger and sorrow. And she talked about her own background. She talked about her own personal perspective. It was on Thursday morning. You can find it. You can subscribe to our podcast. You can find it on our YouTube channel. She talked about being racist to her core. Not currently, not in a way that impacts her actions right now, but she described her journey. What did she say? I'm a 45-year-old white chick with a PhD. Isn't that what she said?
With a PhD.
Or a white girl, white chick, something like that. She just kind of spat it out. I'm a white girl with a, and she goes on and she just, as she does, Jody Carrington, when you interview her, you kind of put on your 5-point seatbelt because you never know which way it's going to go. And it's not only because of what she brings to the table, but I feel as an interviewer, it's what she brings out of me. She has this kind of, it feels like a co-host type thing. It doesn't feel like an interviewee thing. And she brought it out. And I'm thinking of the same things that Eric's thinking. I think of so many shitty little comments that I made, stupid jokes that I made as a kid that I'm appalled by. As a matter of fact, I like the way that Eric, I sit here and I try to think of words that fit. Like, what word will convey how horrific all of this is? And not just the residential schools, but the attitudes of people in Canada, including me and including Eric, that over the years have created an environment that have made these attitudes and the perpetuation of these attitudes permissible. And Eric saying, I just feel sad about it. How are we all reconciling this in our personal journeys? Scott says, I don't say this to be a jerk. There are so many stories around this province and this country that it just feels like it's too much for me to truly care about all of it because my heart is overwhelmed. That from Scott. And who could blame anybody for feeling that way? Scott qualifies it, saying, I'm not saying this to be a jerk. I understand where Scott's coming from. How can you possibly, if once you start talking about deaths of children in care and you recognize and acknowledge that things aren't fixed now, then how do you think about anything else? Let me get, really heavy, especially heavy for a moment. When you hear people talking about unearthing, these graves of children, these unmarked graves, how do you think about anything else? And then you hear about child sexual abuse. And then how do you think about anything else? That there are children right now in abusive circumstances, that these so-called lockdowns, or at least the semi-isolation that's been a reality for so many people, has meant that children that are targets of predators in their own homes, women and children that are survivors right now, bravely every single day encountering domestic violence, have had no reprieve. The kids haven't been able to go to school in some circumstances, which is where they're getting their only nutritious meal or a break from the abuse. How do you walk with that every single day? When I talk to advocates, I ask, how do you go home? How do you sleep? How are you able to enjoy a barbecue? How are you able to, police officers, how are you able to see what you see? We read that powerful letter a couple of weeks ago from a victim services counselor that wrote in and described the assignment of accompanying law enforcement to notify families of sudden deaths like motor vehicle accidents and the things that people are carrying. I don't know. I don't have the answer. But nobody would blame somebody like Scott from finding some way to give his brain or his heart a break, to go for a trail run or whatever it is. Not that it solves anything, and I don't mean to be pithy or shallow on this, but people are trying to find ways just to process every single day.
I think it's important to not look away. And the reason why I say that, I was just looking it up, and the first Muslims to arrive in Canada, do you want to wager a guess on when that was?
Probably. Well, at least I know that the oldest mosque in Canada is like well over 100 years old. So
you betcha.
Yeah.
First Muslims arrived in Canada in 1871.
Yeah.
So to me, this idea that it's this population is othered is long-standing, and it's because people have been looking away. And as we've heard time and time again, people, Indigenous communities are saying, we're not shocked. We've known this for decades, for a century or more. We've known. But people have been looking away. So yes, it is a lot to take on, but it is ours to take on and to listen and to reckon. This is like the term reckoning. This is the reckoning.
Angela White, representing the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. We're so grateful Angela's agreed to join us today. Welcome to Real Talk, Angela, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me and inviting me. This is, I think, an amazing opportunity to begin dialogue and peeling back the layers.
You know, the word that we hear most frequently from non-Indigenous people when asked to comment on this, we just heard the same word from both the mayors of Lethbridge and High River. We've heard the same word just right now from the producer of this show, Sarah Hoyles, and from a myriad of others, is listen. What's the most important thing that you hope that people across this country are hearing, are listening to right now?
I think one of the most important things I think that we as a society can do is step back, pause, and first be willing to understand and acknowledge and learn, but don't overpower with your voice exactly what Sarah was saying. Listen, don't come in thinking that you have the solutions to all these problems, because nobody has the solutions. And two, if you're talking about any marginalized society that I guess that's out there, no one else can actually talk on your behalf. It's only you that can do it.
Angela, before we get into some of the specifics and what the last couple of weeks has looked like through your eyes and what the advocacy efforts and support has looked like, why don't we get a more clear understanding for the benefit of our audience on what the Indian Residential School Survivors Society is all about? This was not formed, let's be very clear, this was not formed in the last 2 weeks. This is a society that's been doing important work for quite some time.
Yeah, we've actually been doing the work that we've been doing for almost 30 years now, quietly doing the work and getting out to community and creating culturally appropriate and culturally safe spaces for healing for Indigenous populations throughout this province. And it's just recently, we're kind of put in that limelight and trying to allow everyone to get caught up to where we're at, or what the work we've been doing for the last several years. And our organization was established specifically for the settlement agreement in this country that was to help resolve and bring some sort of compensation to former students of Indian Residential School. And it started out first as more of a court-style setting where you'd have people cross-examining people's testimony with what was happening in school, and that was very, very traumatic for a lot of survivors. And so they moved it to something a little bit more subtle, I guess, and where they called it an IAP adjudication hearing, independent assessment process. And that's where only the adjudicator and the claimant had voice at the table. Lawyers, churches, government, all weren't able to speak at that except those two. And of course, IRSSS was there along with other organizations to help support those survivors through those traumatic testimonies.
Angela, you talk about the limelight. The attention that this story is seeing, and much of it is extremely important, obviously. I mean, you see it in a sense, I think a nation waking up, and I think that people that are, I saw something, this isn't too abstract of a comment. I saw somebody yesterday, a friend of mine who's a thrifter. She goes to like thrift shops and finds things, and she simply posted this T-shirt that she had found, and it was this orange T-shirt that said "Every Child Matters," and there was a beautiful dream catcher on it. And I thought two things. I thought, number one, isn't it interesting that she's seeking that out right now? Number two, isn't it interesting that somebody had thrifted it, right? That it had been thrown in the thrift pile, and then now she found it. And I sat and I just stared at the post for a while because I kind of go deep into things sometimes, and it just felt to me like that image really said a lot. So that's the impact that it's having on millions of people across the country. But I would imagine that it's been a very difficult couple of weeks for survivors of residential schools.
You are absolutely correct in that. It's more so, I guess the difficulty comes is, I think I heard Sarah say, or yourself say earlier, that we as a community have known that these testimonies there's truth behind it. And the rest of the world kept questioning, denying. That didn't happen. That was a long ago. Those are a lot of those sentiments that we hear. And so the survivors are actually having that reconciliation amongst themselves of how their voices have finally been validated and heard, and that because of the narrative that was playing out at these schools by the people in authority, the priests, the nuns, the workers, that they are worthless. Their voices would never mean anything. No one would ever believe a word that came out of their mouths because, in quotations, they are nothing but dirty, savage Indians. As a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old child, you're going to start believing that narrative. And when people go through trauma, childhood trauma, and they are triggered, they are automatically yanked back into that childlike behavior. They may be 60, they may be 70, but they're still being triggered into that childhood trauma. And so a lot of what they're reconciling with themselves is, I was seeing what I was seeing. I'm not crazy. They do believe me. And that's a lot to take in all in one fell swoop. And it's a lot to have these survivors start peeling back those layers of trauma and looking at it, and because their voices were silenced for so many years. They whispered, they didn't always tell their family, but they whispered to other survivors. They whispered to people who were willing to listen, whether it's in counseling or therapy. But even then, it was easier to whisper, I guess, because that narrative was there. And now that it has come to a full-fledged shout, I think it's one of relief that people are finally believing them, and two, they have to reconcile that trauma again within themselves.
A remarkable development in the House of Commons yesterday, a motion calling for the government to end, quote, its belligerent and litigious approach to justice for Indigenous children by dropping 2 appeals that the government is currently fighting in federal court in relation to the child welfare system. The motion passed 271 to 0 unanimously with support from all parties, including Liberal backbenchers. Now, it's important to note that it's a non-binding request on the government. Liberal cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister himself, Justin Trudeau, did not cast a vote. What does that say to you? And what does the result of the vote say to you?
I think the fact that basically has said exactly what we thought. Justin Trudeau, when he first was elected, he really went into Indigenous communities and he really pedaled hard to get their vote. And he did get it in that first round. And what this really does say, not as a ED, not as a just a person in this country, that he is the depiction of a wolf in sheep's clothing. He says what he needs to say to get for people to believe, and that's exactly what they did in residential schools. They tell you what you need to hear. People who who seem to be allies, they tell you what you want to hear, but behind closed doors, that's when their true colors really shine. And we deal with that all the time in our daily lives. And I think one of my elders have always said, be careful of the ones that come closest to you, because they're not always there to help you and lift you up. And, that says a lot to me.
What would meaningful action from a federal government look like to begin? I mean, I know what you're going to say, and I don't know what you're going to say, but I suspect you might say, well, I don't know, maybe the calls to action, maybe implementing the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Ryan, you may have heard of it. Is that where it begins?
I think that's a good start. Instead of allowing those TRC recommendations to collect dust, really look at that and start fixing what they spent millions and millions of dollars on a study. That's just sitting there again, collecting dust. I always say, if you want to, I used to always say when I was doing this, the best way to get government to spend money is ask them to do a study, because they'll throw money at a study. But if you ask them to fix something, there's bureaucracy, there's loopholes, there's hurdles, constant hurdles to keep jumping over, and they will never get there. Looking at the Mary Ellen Turpel inquiry to the treatment of Indigenous people in this country, looking at the MMIWG recommendations that they spent a lot of money on across this country, and they've released that $27 million last week with regards to MMIWG. That money was there 6 or 7 years ago, and they just released it today or last week. What does that also say? Looking at those relationships and actually moving towards action on building trust and relationships with people in authority, such as Child and Family Services, such as RCMP, such as nurses, doctors, and teachers. And, bringing back that trust and building it from scratch up. You can't build trust if you're going to start up here. You have to break it down and build it back from that, from the foundation up. Because once it's up here and you're trying to build it, what about all of that past? We haven't acknowledged it. We haven't looked at it. We haven't actually done anything to make things better. I was also saying things like, if the province wants to show up, what the federal government's doing, let's look at building some of those relationships right now without waiting for any federal approval. If the federal government was really wanting to do something, let's look about getting the basic human right of clean drinking water in all of our communities. Let's look at building up, breaking down those stereotypical situations where we are only, 2% of the Canadian population, yet we are almost 75% within the child and family services and prison systems. Let's break those issues down and make real changes and real impacts to community. Those are some of the areas I think we can really start at. If we want to start looking and holding churches accountable, let's have them start putting some money behind that and building back what they took away, the languages, the culture, the traditions. That would mean something.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there are. There was the Pope acknowledged this in public statements a short time ago. And you smirk like I do in the sense that what I'm saying is, I guess he used a couple of words, although he said it. There were even some areas where, to be candid, he kind of blew it right out of the gates. I think talking about how his thoughts are with Canadians, and I've seen Indigenous people push back and say, "Well, start again." Right away, start again. Did not apologize. I know that there are Indigenous leaders from across the country that intend to head to the Vatican to seek an apology from the Pope. Word out of the Vatican, I've not seen this confirmed, is that the Pope is, at this point, leaving this with Canadian bishops. There's some possibility rumored this summer where potentially the Pope may visit Canada and issue an official apology. I've seen a lot of people have conversations about class action lawsuits. I've seen people talk about reparation. I've seen people talking about starting to tax churches. There are many different conversations, all stemming from this tragic discovery. Where do you think that should begin? What's your perspective on this, Angela?
From a grassroots level, from basically, the people that we're working with directly, I think for the most part, any apology that comes now is meaningless, but and it will fall on deaf ears, so to speak, because they've had decades to apologize and have refused every step of the way. I think from a personal perspective, he needs to apologize on behalf of the Catholic Church because, one, it's the right thing to do. There's nothing, whether we agree with it or not, they have yet to make any acknowledgement or even ownership of all of the harm generationally that has plagued us as Indigenous people. You look at, let me just say it this way, as an Indigenous person, I have struggled my entire life with a lot of intergenerational trauma. I grew up very angry. I grew up in a household of violence, of alcohol, and all of these things that, you kind of normalize in your life, and that's our normal life. And I completely acknowledge that my upbringing is a sliver of what other people in my same situation have gone through. But depending on what the supports you have at home, depending on how much healing has done in your household, depending on if you're going through high school, what counselors, what teachers are actually helping you and lifting you up during that entire process. I remember in high school, I was constantly asked to go down to see my counselor during English, and English class, you're like, yeah, sure, let's go, because you're a teenager, you want to get out of class. And this counselor would constantly sit me down because I was also an athlete in high school, so very few Indigenous people back in the day would actually try out for high school sports, right? So he kind of took that interest in you, and so he's like, would sit you down and he'd go, okay. And they called me Angel back then. Okay, Angel, how are you doing? And I'm saying, I'm fine. And he'd go, no, really, how are you doing? And I was thinking, oh my God, what the hell does he want from me? And this would go on for months and months and months. And finally, I think it was where he was building enough trust to just open a sliver of that door so that you can actually feel safe in a place where you never really had connection with before. And it's those little acts that actually help you rise above all of that trauma and do something productive in your life. I mean, that's, I think, my personal perspective on it.
I'm first of all, I would like to speak with you for 6 hours sometime. I just have a world of respect for you. You and I have never spoken before, and I've never met you personally. You strike me as somebody that has this incredible strength of character, that is able to provide supports for people and speak on behalf of people and provide people a voice. Yet at the same time, I cannot imagine how you would not be carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I mean, how do you do when you do the work that you do with a group like the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, considering the magnitude of this trauma and the implications of it on generations of Indigenous people? How do you continue to do what you do?
A lot of grounding, a lot of healing, and a lot of forgiveness. And acts of forgiveness, as well as moving into a place of self-care. And by self-care, it was also learning to like yourself again and moving towards loving yourself. And I think, if I may say that, acts of forgiveness was the biggest step for me. And as one of my dear friends would always say, you got to remember that you're not forgiving. You're not forgiving the person, or you're forgiving the person. What you're doing is you're also forgiving the behavior. It's not that you are actually saying they get off the hook. You're still holding them accountable, but you're building those boundaries around yourself in that process. And so once I started realizing that it was an anchor holding me back, that's when I was able to do the work that I've been able to do for so many years. I mean, not a lot of people can do this work in over a 14-year period and not burn out emotionally because of the stories and the testimonies that you're hearing. And as a parent and now a grandmother, I think it was back when I was in my 30s, I had a conversation with each of my daughters, and it was very simple. I just said, I'm sorry for how I was as a parent in my time of healing. I'm sorry I wasn't the best parent I possibly could be. And they all had different reactions. Like when I was in my 30s, I think my daughter was maybe just turning 20 herself. And so, I mean, not 20, 19, 18, 17, something like that. Because I was quite young when I had my first daughter. And and she's now 30, and she looks at, back then she looked at me and she says, Mom, I'll always love you, but sometimes I absolutely don't like you when you were going through those healing processes, because I was a very angry person and I was very reactive.
Of course. I mean, how could you not be? I mean, I can't even imagine. Angela, you and I come from very different backgrounds. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk to you. You know, I'm thinking back, I grew up a Calgary kid, right? And you know, my dad's office, where it was a medical practice, almost directly bordered the Tsuut'ina Nation, and many of his patients were Indigenous, and I had an opportunity to get to know a few of them. I know it was always important for my dad. The walls of his office were adorned with Indigenous art. He had a dream catcher up in his personal office that had been a gift from a patient. It was always on my radar. The culture was on my radar. But I also think of how I grew up, you know, attending the Calgary Stampede, for example, and they had the so-called Indian Village, and you know, you'd look at these photos of these great chiefs and these Indigenous leaders that had, you know, participated, whether it was in a smudge or a peace pipe ceremony with these settlers, and were oftentimes sort of portrayed as, if I can speak plainly and candidly, as like, you know, the sort of the smart, the reason why they're so great, or the smartest thing that they ever did was partner with us, you know, to sort of like, you know, be these deal makers and these brokers. And now I think back to these archived photos, and I think of the photos of these chiefs standing with, whether they're political leaders or business leaders or whatever the case may be, and I see the photos through such a different lens. I'm trying to understand the rage that some of them must, the inherent disdain is not a strong enough word. I mean, it's you know, people are starting to use, Canadians now using words like colonizer, talking about cultural genocide. I mean, to me, you talk about this anger deep inside you as one individual. I cannot even imagine how entire communities were able to even wrap their minds around cohabiting on the same land. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we don't always look at is as an intergenerational survivor, you had the anger, but you didn't know what to connect it to. Honestly, our grandparents and parents didn't talk about their stories. You just knew that there was like you said, an inherent anger within, and where is it coming from, and what are you going to do with it? And growing up, I was actually talking about, thinking about this the other day. I think I'm very much like you. And, you know, I'd be in one situation and all of a sudden that one situation will bring me back to so many different thoughts and processes that's going on in my mind. And I look back to my high school, and where I come from, it's a little bit of a, I guess one of my aunts was constantly in a fight every single day around school because she was Indigenous, and she learned how to fight. We all learned how to fight growing up one way or another. And then I went into high school, like she's probably 12, 15 years older than me. And so when I got into high school, I was asking my one daughter, I said, I look back at that and I'm like, my friends were my friends. They didn't look at me as being Indigenous or Native. They looked at me as a friend. And I said, I wonder what that was really about. I mean, I look at some of my other cousins and family and their experience. And, sometimes it wasn't always the best. It was always that stereotypical rhetoric that kind of comes down onto you. And my daughter says, I said, well, I was an athlete and I was a really good athlete. And maybe that's it. Like they accepted me because of that. And any one of my friends or family that were athletes, they were accepted pretty much the same way as well. We had really amazing bonds and friendships with non-Indigenous people growing up. And so I really had to look at that. And I reached out to some of them and it was really, and one of my friends had said, as I grew up, she goes, that's when we start buying into or using language such as you're saying, colonizer language. And then I look at those relationships we had, and she goes, I was in a training session and, the facilitator says, you should be mindful of your words because that looks like you're taking ownership of the local Indigenous populations and those friendships and that they may take offense to it. And I was thinking, and I told her, I said, I cherished our friendships. I enjoyed them because we were all friends. Like we just hung out. We just did lunch. We went, weekend stuff. And she goes, I was really questioning those relationships. She said, I was really questioning them because I thought, was I taking that colonized perspective or was it real friendship? And I said, for me, from my perspective, it was real. There was no undertones of racial tension there whatsoever. And I appreciate and accepted those relationships. And she's like, she goes, and it was like a breath of fresh, like a relief from her. She's like, I started, like I said, when I was questioning that, she goes, I really was going, maybe I wasn't their friend. Maybe we didn't have those relationships. And so I think the best advice I could probably give to people on that is follow your heart, because your heart will tell you everything you need to know. It's when the brain starts getting interwoven into that, that's when we start questioning what those realities really were about.
Angela, received a very moving message from a firefighter in a Canadian urban center, a major urban center, and I read it on the show last week. And a portion of what he wrote about how he was heartbroken about the responses that they had made, countless responses in the inner city. As he put it, responding to calls involving Indigenous people, suicides, cold weather exposure deaths, overdoses, homicides. And he wrote about how he remembered almost dismissing them or the seriousness of them because they were Indigenous people and because there were pervasive problems with the Indigenous population. He wrote, I'm so broken that I felt that way. And he said, and I now see through these residential schools. He says, we broke these people, their spirit, their will, their reverence for the land. And I pray that somehow they can return to their ways and their relationship with the land and their customs, their traditions, and their families. That's just one person expressing their personal journey, personal and professional, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk about 7 generations and what healing might look like. And I want to ask you if you're optimistic or if you believe that that culture and those traditions and that spirituality and the understanding of medicines and everything can be restored.
I will say straight out that, yes, I have hope and faith that that's the case. And I look at this again from my own personal journey. My grandparents all went to residential school. My mom went to a Catholic day school. My dad didn't go, but so, I'm either one generation out or 2 generations out, depending on what side of the family you're talking on. And you look at perhaps me and my sister's journey, and I look at how despite everything we've gone through, how much we've succeeded in life. Not just grasping the colonial educational system, but trying to put our feet deeply rooted into the grounds and understanding what that culture is and what it means to us, and moving forward with that. And then I look at my daughters and how well they're doing. And I say my oldest, I probably screwed up the most. I mean, that's our test child, right? And then, so I screwed her up the most. And then my baby, she's a true millennial, right? Like the world revolves around her, and that's just the way it is. And then my middle daughter, she gave me a grandson, and I look at him, and he doesn't understand anything that we've been going through, and he's learning the languages, not just the Hokkaido language, but the Nitomath language, which is his father's side. So he's learning both of those languages plus English, and how much he loves hunting, how much he loves fishing. And then I look at my baby girl, and she's picking up the language and speaking it on a regular basis, and she's learning how to write it because it wasn't a language, so they're learning how to do that. And so I see it on social media all the time on how she's actually interacting. And she's a hunter, she's a fisher, she loves getting out collecting medicines. She has her drum group with all young ladies that prove amazing strength and gives amazing medicine to those that are seeking it through the songs that they've created and composed. And that brings me amazing hope. And so even if my girls are like either second or third generation, you look at how much healing has been done in a very short period of time, because again, what is that? My grandson would be like the third generation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the residential schools and all those policies. How many leaps we've actually succeeded in life in that very short period of time. Yes, they tried to break us. And I said, what they ended up doing is just fracturing us just a small amount so that we can actually come back a lot stronger with the weight of our ancestors helping us along the way.
Emma is a member of our live audience right now. She says Angela's vulnerability and strength is absolutely amazing in every sense of the word. Angela, you strike me as somebody that's pretty aware of what is happening across the country, and so I'll acknowledge I'm throwing you political questions, and I'm throwing you curriculum questions, and I'm asking you to hit on a whole bunch of fronts. But I'm just you're here, and you're emanating wisdom here and I know that a lot of people are really appreciating the message that you have. I spoke to federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh the other day here on the show, and he said, I feel really weird calling these residential schools. He says it feels really weird calling these schools, considering the role that they played in this cultural genocide, in wiping. You talk about the idea of savages and some of the justification for the residential schools, some of the written correspondence between church leaders and political leaders that has people so appalled, that has statues toppling, that has schools being renamed on the fly. There's a lot going on. And amid all of this, there's a conversation east of you in our home province of Alberta right now about this draft curriculum. One of the authors of this curriculum, Chris Champion, has made deplorable comments, including recently by way of the Dorchester Review. People can search those themselves. I've spoken about it at length. The curriculum in general is being criticized, including from Indigenous leaders that had initially endorsed it, like Treaty 8 Grand Chief Billy Joe Labucan, who originally spoke in support of it, now describes himself as feeling like he was the token Indian in all of this, that he was essentially misled. What is it when we're talking about schools, okay, so Jagmeet Singh's comment about residential schools, we talk about the role of schools now in reconciliation. What role does curriculum have to play?
Curriculum is a huge component of how we actually move forward as a society. And you can actually look at the various segments of generational curriculum as we're moving forward and how much how much or how little things have changed and how it has shaped what we learn and what we teach Canadians along that way. I've always said, if I can go back to, I think I'm going to go back a few steps as well to what you're saying about Jagmeet Singh. I always say, under the guise of school, this was not a school. It was an institution that was put into place for the elimination of an entire race of people, whether it was through taking away their culture, language, and traditions, and there would be collateral damage along the way. At the moment that you dehumanize a race of people, that's when you actually, it's easier to roll out those agendas. And within these educational, so-called educational facilities, they also use those children as experiments, seeing things like, what does starvation do on a body? What happens to, how do we actually cure or actually go about treating tuberculosis? And so they actually had study groups of children that were intentionally infected with TBs, not for the benefit of the Indigenous population, but for the non-Indigenous population, because TB was something that was rampant in our communities. So you have dentists that were actually put into these institutions and paid by how many teeth they pulled out. If you go to a survivor and you actually look at my mom doesn't have, all of them have those implants or those dentures, because a lot of them don't have teeth anymore. Dentists were paid based on how many teeth that they brought into the federal government. These are all documented. It's all there. So no, it wasn't schools. And those that survived, they actually were placed into learning facilities that would teach them the jobs that no one else would want. Farmers, cleaners, I think one was a baker. So yeah, I agree with Jagmeet on that. It's not they weren't schools. It was a farce of using amazing English languages to help or disguise what these institutions were really put into place for. Then if we go into curriculum, if we don't, I used to always say, history is taught based on the ones that believe that they won the war. So if you look at our history curriculum, what history has been taught to all of our children in these schools.
Yeah, written by the victors, so to speak.
Yeah, and when you look at how many years these policies and deliberate policies and legislations that were put in place by the federal government, you can actually see hundreds and hundreds of years of attempts to eliminate and eradicate the Indigenous population of this country. And that being said, starting off with enfranchisement. Enfranchisement was put in place to try and have Indigenous people voluntarily give up their identity to become brown people, but living a white world. And my grandfather, who fought in World War II, was enfranchised because the only way he could go fight in World War II is if he gave up his Indigenous identity. And then when you come back, you're not white enough to be in the white world, and you're not Indian enough to be in the so-called Indian world, defined in that you're kind of in limbo. Then you have all of these other policies that were put in place to deliberately handcuff Indigenous populations. And the biggest one for us was when you're from Alberta, so you know that they're very nomadic in Alberta. They followed the food source and they moved around. So one of the biggest hindrances in the policies was creating reservation systems. Those reservation systems were put in place to maintain and isolate Indigenous populations. And then so to to have somebody come in and monitor that, they called them the Indian agent. That Indian agent was responsible for giving anyone that wanted to leave the boundaries of the reserve a notice that says you have until this date to this date, from this time to this time. If you don't come back within that, we're going to send the RCP out and arrest you and put you in jail. You know, there's all these things that were put into place to try and achieve that one mandate, elimination. And when you really look at that history, then you start to understand how close they did come. But through the strength of those that actually survived, I call them the strongest people I know, because they hung on to the threads that they remembered so that they could pass it down to us. And that's what we're trying to rebuild and rebraid and make strong again.
Absolutely incredible. Angela White is speaking with us, joining us this morning in the capacity of her role with the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. I want to direct you to their website where they're accepting donations, where you can help contribute to and further their work. You can offer your supports in a number of ways. I encourage you to check out IRSSS.ca. That's IRSSS.ca, the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Angela, I can't adequately or fully convey my appreciation for your candor, your courage this morning. You have got our audience, I know, talking in a way that is providing encouragement and some optimism in the face of absolutely devastating circumstances, a devastating and deplorable reality. The work that you've been doing for decades is absolutely remarkable and so very important, to say the least. Thank you on so many fronts, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Ryan, for having me. And I agree. We had never met before, but I think you and I could probably have some amazing conversations during a cup of tea for sure.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. Next time I'm in your neck of the woods. I can't wait to be out there. I will look you up, and you do the same. Once this pandemic's done, we'll be in a nice big new studio, and we're going to be welcoming in-studio guests, and I would love to bring you in for a round table or something like that. And hey, when we can shake hands again, you'll be one of the first people I'll be looking for. So thank you, Angela. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Angela White of the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Sometimes I feel like after a conversation like that, you just reflect. You know, I mean, I guess my job is to sit here and come up with a bunch of words and do a bunch of talking, but what an absolutely remarkable person. And remarkable courage and incredibly important work. And I feel like, I mean, Sarah Hoyles, you know, your job is to select which clip that we'll push out to promote the interview, that will direct people to the full interview on our podcast or on our YouTube page. And I don't even know where you begin there. I don't know where you begin. I mean, I think, you know, we'll post the link to that entire interview. By the way, when I tweet out those links, you know, if you click on the link that I push out, it'll take you right to the start of that interview. I feel like this is required viewing, right? This is like a 40-minute conversation that everybody needs to pay attention to, regardless of who they are, where they're from, what their life experience is, how they're processing what they're seeing. The dentists, I mean, if you're like, that to me is just, what?
That is, for me, that is the first that I have learned of that.
Yeah.
And I think that is precisely the point, is that we need to listen. And I'm a broken record with that word, but it's really landed for me that us white folk, we need to listen. And, you know, curriculum, why do I not know this, is because it has not been taught. There hasn't been listening, and then it hasn't been taught.
And I'm so grateful for, I mean, audience members of ours that aren't white folk, you know, people that are contributing their conversation or their perspectives, rather, you know, people that are saying, hey, us people of color. I saw it was a comment a while back saying this is, I mean, we know what it's like to be othered. We understand what this is like. She's speaking our language, you know. Yeah, Sharon says that interview should be shown in classrooms, right? Sherry just says, may we listen? Thank you, Angela. Jess says speechless is okay sometimes. I agree. I absolutely agree. I'll tell you, I'm going to go for a walk after we wrap the show. And I encourage you to do the same thing. Hope says, my heart, although sad, feels full just listening to her. Her message is fierce, yet the way she delivers it is so calm. That's a great way to put it. She's kind and also a force of nature. Do you know what I mean? Like, she's had her own journey. She shares it.
Yeah, there's like four. Like there's a.
Yeah.
I don't
Let me
know.
say this. You know, Nicole says, no, Ryan, she gets a hug. Forget the handshake. You know what? I double clutched on that. I was going to say hug. Certain sensitivities and developments in society. I used to be. I don't know. If this is a weird angle to take. I like confronting comments head on. I like just telling people how I feel about things. I used to be a real hugger.
You're a hugger.
Yeah. Did I ever tell you the story about the guest that came on my previous radio show and I went to give her a hug because I'd known her for quite some time? She was in our bullpen and we were in a commercial break. What that must be like to go get a coffee during a commercial break. I remember that back in the day. But anyway, so we go into the bullpen and she's ready to come in and I was like, hey, and I went to kind of give her a hug because I'd known her for 5 or 6 or 7 years. And she's like, not a hugger, and kind of put her hand out. And I was like appalled, first of all, super awkward, felt like an idiot, totally respect that position. And then I go into our studio as we're coming out of commercial break and I click on her Twitter bio to introduce her. And her Twitter bio literally says, not a hugger. That was her social media bio, was how little she had an appetite for hugs. And Nicole, ever since then, I've been like, I'm a handshake guy. And then if people want to say, Jespo, no hand, we're hugging, then I'm like all in. I'm all in.
I should add it to my Twitter bio.
Hugging's not big for you?
Not a hugger.
We've never hugged. It's never really seemed appropriate, Sarah.
Well, we're in a pandemic as well.
We've never even shaken hands yet. We haven't even officially shaken hands on your employment.
We have done the elbow bump.
We've done the elbow bump. You signed a piece of paper, handed it to me over the plexiglass, and you were welcomed to the team.
Ta-da.
Guess going, I'm just reading comments. She's, Angela's amazing viewer. She's an angel. She is an angel, and she gets it because she's lived it, unfortunately. She does a lot of good work and she should be praised. I mean, the amazing comments. The comments speak for themselves on the live chat. Crazy Fast Eddie says it's time to change the meaning of Canada. It's a figment of our imagination. This is actually a good time to review the results of our poll of the day yesterday. Plus, I want to get to an email before we sign off. We make decisions on the fly sometime. I lied to you yesterday without meaning to lie to you, everybody. We did intend to get into the results of our past question of the week from our friends at Y Station, our official research and strategy partners. Number one, I want to fast track everybody getting a breath of fresh air and debriefing a little bit. So we'll get into that on tomorrow's show. But I do want to remind you, it's a conversation about racism in sport. We've done a lot of heavy lifting today. I do want to remind you, if you go to ryanjesperson.com right now, though, our current question of the week, super easy to find right at the top of the page. It's about this. And we want to know what effect these conversations around the former residential school in Kamloops, these 215 souls and others, what it's had on your, what sort of effect it's had on your understanding of your identity, whether that's Canadian or otherwise, what you believe can be done, and how how all of us think, basically, that, we should treat or lionize or chastise, or if you believe the concept, cancel people from our history that have participated in these crimes. We're doing the question of the week a little bit different this week in that we're going to be presenting the results to you on Friday. We wanted to do a fast-tracked one. We wanted to see where the audience lands on this. So ryanjesperson.com, right at the top is where you can answer our question of the week. We'd be grateful. I'm hoping to see about 1,000 respondents on this one. Want to see a good sample size. I want to remind you that the team at Kubi Energy yesterday was proud to present Positive Reflections, and what an amazing Positive Reflections it was. We heard back from Debbie, by the way. Debbie's 9-week-old puppy that had discovered its reflection in the mirror. You remember that? We were all speculating on what it was. We're like, is it a terrier? Is it a what is it? Is it a...
And we were all wrong.
We're talking about, well, we were kind of right. See, I pulled the veteran move. As a broadcaster, when you don't quite know, keep it as vague as possible. I do remember saying the word terrier on the air, and Debbie wrote in to say Bruce, her dog, Bruce, is a West Highland Terrier. She says, I would have responded sooner, Rye, but it takes me like 5 hours to get through your show now because there's a lot of pee breaks, training, and playing going on. I assume that Debbie's talking about Bruce. She says, I really enjoy the show. Keep up the good work. Debbie, right back at you. Thanks for tuning in, and good job with Bruce. What a handsome good boy. Bruce, 14 out of 10. Kubi Energy's team also ranking that high in all their solar installations. Just check the customer reviews. They're Tesla certified. They're certified electricians and electrical apprentices, and they're doing installs on residential, commercial, and industrial applications across Western Canada right now. You can learn more about your sustainable energy future and a government grant that can help you cover the cost of some of it by going to kubienergy.ca. Of course, you can submit your positive reflections as well to talk@ryanjesperson.com. That's also where you can send in your trash talk. The team at Local Waste wants us to remind you that's coming up again on Friday. It's how we wrap up our broadcast week. It's your chance to blow off a little steam. The team at Local Waste wants to send out an alert right now, in all seriousness, to business owners across the province of Alberta. They're also doing business in Saskatchewan right now and always looking to grow. There's another waste services provider that's tricking people, quite frankly. These are my words, not theirs. A waste services provider that's misrepresenting the status of their contracts following an ownership change. And they're tricking people, quite frankly, into new long-term contracts. The team at Local Waste wants me to remind you, entrepreneurs, that you always have choice when it comes to who you partner with for waste management, recycling, and if something stinks, it's always good to call Local Waste. They can help you deal with it at localwaste.ca. Yesterday, we asked you how you were feeling. We put out an unscientific, unofficial Twitter poll about how you feel about that hashtag that was trending over the weekend, Cancel Canada Day. And some pretty interesting results. The poll is now closed. The final results, we had 1,357 people cast a vote, so just shy of 1,400. Pretty interesting results. I don't know if they're surprising or not. 1 in 5, just under 21% of respondents said that you intend to cancel Canada Day this year. About 43%, just under a majority, 43% said you will celebrate Canada Day, and then 36% said it's complicated. So as Sarah reminded us yesterday, you've either got about 80% of people saying, I'm going to celebrate, or I'm going to celebrate or observe it, but it's complicated. A lot of people pushed back on my use of the word. I gave you the options: canceling Canada Day, celebrating Canada Day, or it's complicated. The use of the word celebrating was not an accident. I felt like if you're wrestling with the word celebrating, you should choose it's complicated, which is what I would have done. I did not vote on my own poll. I don't know if you can vote on your own polls, but regardless. So the point that you made, either 80% of respondents are celebrating or acknowledging it's complicated, or about 57% are canceling it or acknowledging it's complicated.
I'm gonna throw a total wrench into this and say, instead of saying that they all go one way or the other, why don't we just split it right down the middle of the it's complicated?
Yeah. But people
this is so unscientific.
But it's interesting because, like I said, I've done multiple interviews in past years, oftentimes raising the ire of people. People would be furious. Some people were calling me a traitor for facilitating conversation about why some people were canceling Canada Day, so to speak, now. I mean, again, unscientific, unofficial, this Twitter poll, but 1,400 people, 1,357 people respond, and 21% say they're canceling Canada Day, 1 in 5. It's an interesting conversation. Now, we received many responses, many replies to my tweet, which I always appreciate. And I don't know who this person is, but I follow Sunshiny. Follow Sunshiny with 2 N's and 2 I's. Sunshiny said, well, why don't Canadians use this day, July 1st, to reach out to Indigenous people? I'm proud to be Canadian, but I'm ashamed of the way Canada's treated Indigenous peoples. I commit to listening to Indigenous people and working in partnership to build an inclusive democracy. I pledge my allegiance to this nation, to all its people, especially Indigenous peoples, and I humbly accept the responsibility to right the wrongs that have oppressed people of Indigenous ancestry. Maybe instead of Canada Day, we call it Reconciliation of Canada Day. Sunshiny says, I want to be able to celebrate Canada because it's It's people live in peace and harmony together. I commit to making this a reality by making this day, the first Canada Day, that truth and reconciliation begins in earnest. Today is the first day of a united Canada. I know some people will push back on that characterization. That's fine. This is one person's feedback. Sunshiny goes on to say, I want to be part of an inclusive Canada that celebrates and honors its Indigenous peoples. I want to promote Indigenous ways of being, knowing, thinking, and I want to stop accepting silent genocide. I want to elevate Indigenous voices. I want to ease the suffering of those that are still healing. I want to learn about the genocide committed against Indigenous people and hold those responsible accountable. I want to learn about Indigenous worldviews and how to welcome those views within my own understanding of what is Canadian culture. That was one response from someone, and I appreciate that. You can send us an email anytime to talk@ryanjesperson.com. I'm going to wrap with this. A powerful email from Jerry. You may remember during our conversation yesterday about the opioid crisis in Canada, in Alberta and BC, that I read a couple of comments off our live chat from Jerry, who was talking about her husband, estranged, the father of her children, talking about how he needs supervised consumption, how she hopes that he can return from his houselessness, his life on the streets, his life of opioid addiction, and how she's optimistic and hopeful that he can take his rightful place in the lives of his children again. Jerry followed up with an email, and I want to wrap the show with this. She said, Ryan, Sarah, Sam, I've thought about writing the show several times, and today I'm finally sitting down to do it. I've been a listener of the podcast for quite some time. Jerry says, at first, as a matter of fact, I was a podcast listener, but lately I've been tuning in live on YouTube. Jerry, welcome. She says, I don't normally comment in the live chat. I'm usually busy working while I listen. Thanks to everybody that listens while they work. She says, today was a day off, and while listening to your guests talking about the opioid crisis, I'd left that comment, and then you read it on air. She says, I'm the mom who's raising 3 daughters, 18, 16, almost 12. They haven't seen their dad in over 6 years because of his opioid addiction. We live in Grand Prairie, Alberta, and their dad, my ex, left to Calgary shortly after our separation. When we first separated, I thought that would finally be the thing that would prompt him to seek help. It didn't. And things got worse, and he's been to jail, and he's overdosed a few times, and he's currently homeless, and he can't pay any child support, and I would still give anything for my girls to be able to just see him again, to have a conversation with him, to hug him. They miss him a lot. They worry about him in a way that kids shouldn't have to worry about their parents. We do get texts from him from time to time, but it's not uncommon for several months to pass without any word. And at first, I was so angry with him for not getting clean. But as the years have passed, my understanding of what he's been through and my compassion have both grown. I've realized that getting help and getting clean is a lot more complicated than it would have been maybe back in the day, right? It's a lot more complicated than the so-called tough love or talking to people about how they have a choice. I'm experiencing it firsthand. These methods don't work, or he'd have been back with us a long time ago. I no longer look at him or talk about him as a so-called drug addict. He's a person. He's a dad, a really great one. He's a son, a brother, an uncle, a friend. He's a human being who deserves life just as much as anybody else. Even though I've moved on and I'm now engaged to somebody else, I still share stories with my girls. Sadly, we spend a lot of time sharing memories about him like you might do after somebody's passed away. The difference is he's still very much alive. Says, I don't have the time to share our whole story in this letter to you, Ryan. I mean, I wish I could, like how he and I got here and how my own views have changed over the years. And I could tell you so much about the pain of loving somebody who's experiencing an addiction, or how his own upbringing as an Indigenous person in Canada likely led him down this path. But I just wanted to thank you for having these real conversations. Thanks for sharing comments like mine on the live chat. People tend to forget that there are real, grieving human beings backing those that are struggling with addiction. I love the show and this audience so much. That from Jerry. Thanks, Jerry. and much love to you. We'll be back at it tomorrow. A big show in store for Wednesday morning, including a conversation, our continued conversations with federal political party leaders. What does the Green Party's strategy look like under new leader Anna May Paul? She's going to join us. We're going to talk to Rabbi Jill Jacobs. And by the way, Stacey Levitt from the Edmonton Jewish Federation joining us on Thursday. Make it a great day. Get some fresh air. Self-care is important, friends. One love.